session. So I just want to advise members the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. And for anyone in the public gallery, you're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and that all devices are muted. You can connect to Assembly Wi-Fi and the password details for that are available on the gallery rules. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. So the first item on the agenda is apologies. I've not received any apologies. It looks like we've got full complement here today. So we can move on to the next item of business, which is Chairperson's business. So delighted again to formally welcome everyone to today's sitting of the committee, and it is a really packed agenda today. It's a really good agenda. I think there's going to be lots of good stuff for us to get into, but I'm going to propose I don't take too much time with this part of the agenda and we get to the main business. So I just want to draw attention to a couple of things very quickly. We've had a couple of informal meetings with stakeholders which have been really, really helpful, and we hope to continue with those in the weeks ahead. And those are found at pages 3 to 6 of your tabled papers, and that provides a record of those meetings, particularly for anyone who wasn't able to attend. We'll consider in forward work planning again how we take those forward. And then also at page 7 of tabled papers we have the itinerary for the visit to Hazelwood Integrated College next week. Any members planning to attend should familiarise themselves with that agenda and make sure that the clerk is aware if you are planning to be there on the day. So unless there's anything arising from that, we will move on to item 3, which is the draft minutes. So the draft minutes of the committee meeting from the 28th of February are at page 6 of your packs. I would propose that the minutes are a complete and accurate record of the proceedings. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. So I get those signed. Okay, so that takes us to item 4, which is our first briefing at committee today. There is a briefing note from the clerk at page 14 in your packs. But I would like to welcome, we've got a few representatives from the Office of the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People. So they're going to come through and then we can welcome our witnesses today. Thank you. So I'll let you all get settled, but you're very, very welcome to the Education Committee today. It's great to have you with us. So I'll just, obviously you will all have the opportunity to introduce yourselves, but I would like to welcome Children's Commissioner, Chris Quinn, Dr. Mairead McCafferty, CEO, and Dr. Arlene Robertson, who is a Policy and Research Officer. So you're all very welcome here today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to present to us, and then for a question and answer session. But we're really mindful of just how critical your organisation is to the work of this committee, so we hope this is the first of many engagements over the course of the mandate. We have a really, really big agenda today for committee, so I'm going to ask for presentation up to 10 minutes because we are tight for time and I want to leave as much time for questions and answers as possible. But really at that stage it is over to you to take it from there.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for having us. So I am aware that you have a tight agenda and we've a lot to get through, so I'm going to try and keep my piece at the outset quite brief so that there's time for discussion. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Chair, Vice Chair and committee members for this opportunity. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and this is the first invitation that I've had to sit in front of a committee in this new mandate. So it's brilliant to be here. I'm just going to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Well, as the Chair said, I'm Mairead McCafferty, Chief Executive at the Office of the Commissioner.
Arlene Robertson, Policy Officer on Education Issues. Lovely to meet everyone.
Thank you. And just by way of format, I'm going to just give a short briefing as to my background and my role. Then I'll go into some issues that are important to my office and I, and then hopefully leave room for discussion at the end of the meeting. So as you will know, my office, the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People, was my primary role is to safeguard and promote the rights of children and young people, and the specific instruments that I'm required to work to is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and its concluding observations and general comments. My office and I have a monitoring role, reporting on the state of children's rights in Northern Ireland to both the UN Committee and also through the state of children's rights in Northern Ireland. You may be aware of one of our calls, as per the concluding observations in the UN Convention or the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and that's to enshrine child rights in domestic law, and I would make that call again today. So in terms of my role as Commissioner, I've been in post 5.5 months, 170 days to be precise, not that I'm counting, and I've engaged with a wide range of children and young people, carers, teachers, parents, youth workers and others. And these engagements have helped my office and I set out our priorities for the next 4 years, and they're detailed within our corporate plan, which has now been submitted to the Department for Communities. Issues including poverty, housing and homelessness, mental health, health and social care are all issues that have been flagged to me. However, I can inform the committee that the issue that is raised most frequently with my office and I is education. And I'm of the view that we need radical and urgent reform in terms of how we do education generally. In my opinion, we have a special educational needs crisis, which I'll speak to more about as we go on. And I believe that the system is massively underfunded, and indeed young people deserve better. There are a range of issues that I think we need to discuss over the course of time, probably too many for today, and they include prioritising the urgent need to transform and invest in the special educational needs and disability system, investing in and prioritising early intervention and ensuring adequate support is given to children and young people through both formal and non-formal education, ensuring that all children have access to mandatory, comprehensive, age-appropriate relationship and sexuality education, supporting the youth work sector, including revising how the current budget is allocated, the use of restrictive practices in educational settings, mental health and wellbeing in schools, school attendances, bullying and the cost of education. I'm also concerned that we have had numerous reviews with regards to education, and these have been costly, and there appears to be an implementation gap. So what we need now is action. We don't need reviews, we need action now, and children deserve better. Some of the actions that I think are fairly straightforward include investing in and implementing the First Start Action Plan to tackle persistent educational underachievement, taking an early intervention approach to emotional health and wellbeing, introducing measures to proactively tackle bullying in schools and improve monitoring, the implementation of statutory guidance for the use of restrictive practices in educational settings, and a revision of the distribution model for the youth service, including how voluntary and community groups are in receipt of their allocation of funding. Given the time is limited today, I propose that we focus on special educational needs, the education budget, RSE and provisions for further engagement with the committee. With regards to SEND, in March 2020, Nikki published the Too Little Too Late rights-based review of special education needs provision in mainstream schools. Our monitoring reports assess the progress made against the 40 recommendations within the report. Our latest update was published just this week, this Monday, the 4th of March, and almost 4 years later, we're seeing little evidence of tangible improvements for children and young people with SEND. The crisis in SEND is a priority for my office when it comes to educational inequality, and I'm calling for an emergency response. Parents and children are in distress and can wait no longer. The delayed implementation of the SEND framework has exacerbated pressures on the SEND system. Funding must be prioritised for implementation of the Act without further delay. Nikki has been monitoring EA's response to capacity issues in special schools and the establishment of an increasing number of specialist provision in mainstream schools. Representation to our office has identified a range of very concerning issues. There is a clear need for an inclusion policy, and robust evaluation of SPIMS must be undertaken as a priority by the department. I hope that the committee will include this as a priority in your mandate going forward. On the education budget, the current crisis in funding of education is having a detrimental impact on children and young people. This is deeply concerning. Whilst the same budget has rapidly increased and now accounts for approximately 50% of EA's grant block, there is much to be done to ensure children and young people's rights are realised in the context of financial uncertainty and budget allocations. In my opinion, children and young people are disproportionately impacted by cuts. Concerns have been raised on holiday hunger, yet we've seen cuts to schemes to assist with this. Furthermore, we need to expand, nurture and healthy, happy minds, for example, as practical options. We need to work from the principle of protecting the most vulnerable in society from budget cuts, particularly children and young people. Departments must consider their obligations under the Children Services Cooperation Act, which came through the Assembly in 2015, and assess the cumulative impact of budget decisions across departments and adjust their budgets to alleviate the impacts. They must do this together. Departments must carefully assess the impact on children in EQIAs on the draft budget under the age category, and Nikki, alongside the UNCRC, urges that every department carries out a full child rights impact assessment on their draft budget and work in partnership with the community and voluntary sector, whose services are generally targeted at those most disadvantaged. On RSE, I know the committee has recently scrutinised this matter. You will be aware that the department has published a circular on relationship and sexuality education, which sets out circumstances under which a pupil may be excused from specified elements of RSE. Nikki strongly objects to the provision within these regulations for parents to opt their child out from elements of RSE. For some time, children and young people have been calling for a curriculum for life to be taught in schools, and this includes RSE, mental health and financial capability, for example. Last year, DE launched a public consultation on RSE. 13,461 responses were received, and only 0.86% of these were from young people. An ETI evaluation from 2023 highlighted pupils' frustrations on not being consulted sufficiently on the content, relevance and delivery of RSE. No appropriate consultation mechanisms were put in place by DE for children and young people. It's not acceptable that children and young people's voices have been overlooked on this issue. Robust monitoring processes are also not evident in DE's guidance. I am more than happy to come back to the committee to discuss this issue, as I know that you've committed to a mini inquiry on it. In terms of further engagement with the committee, as I've said, there's a wide range of issues that I'd like to discuss with you. The issue of education, and particularly special educational needs, are the issues that we receive most complaints about and most issues are raised about. I want to see urgent and radical reform of the education system compliant with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So perhaps following this meeting and as part of our discussion, we can agree a thematic approach to discussing some of them issues. So I'd like to pause, give the committee a chance to engage further in discussion across those range of issues, as well as to invite my colleagues to contribute.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you being very strict with the time there, because that's going to help us through the agenda today. So that is much appreciated, and I think, look, without exception, really, I think everything you've raised all align with the things we've been flagging as priorities for the committee. So that is welcome, and I think as we look to the sort of planning for the future work of the committee, that thematic approach of making sure that we bring you in to inform our thinking and our scrutiny across a whole range of policy issues, we absolutely want to avail of that. I think today we're likely to be focusing quite closely on SEN, so I think that I would just want to bring my questions in that area. and I think members will probably have similar issues that they want to raise. I just wanted to open up something, a more general issue around the Children's Services Cooperation Act. Children's Law Centre provided a fair bit of detail on that in their briefing, and they're following after yourselves, and they feel that there's a wasted opportunity there that the departments haven't utilised, and they particularly highlight that in relation to SEND provision and that working between education and health. So I would just wonder, would you be able to speak to the committee a little bit in terms of how you could maybe foresee that could be utilised better effectively in this mandate to deliver that transformation bit around the early intervention that you've been referring to?
Yeah, well, I'll invite my colleagues in a second, but my initial response would be in agreement that the Children's Services Cooperation Act has not been utilised to its full extent. The Cooperation Act places a duty on public bodies and departments to work together, and it's framed in terms of children and young people's well-being. So I do agree with you that it needs to be utilised, and we need to find ways to encourage government departments to work together for the well-being of children. I'm not sure, Maria, if you would like to come in on that issue.
I mean, it's very welcome. That's the first thing that you raised, Chair, as well. This is something that Nikki has been advising, not just the Education Committee, but the departments across the executive on for a number of years now, because we have seen that there is a lack of cooperation in relation to delivering for children and young people. Obviously, when it comes to SEND, it is absolutely vital that we have education and health working together. How else can we plan for the numbers of children coming into the system in the transition years if we don't know what their health needs are? We don't know what the issues are that have been identified already before they come into the school system. And I know that we have periodic meetings with the education officials, as you'd expect, and have raised this with them. The crisis that happened last summer, when there was a lack of placements for children with SEN, was unacceptable. And we're hearing again that there's something in the region of 1,000 places that have to be found this coming September. This is where we need to get the planning right. This is why it's so vital that the Children's Services Cooperation Act is fully implemented and is used across all our government departments to deliver for children and young people. And you'll know that the Children's Services Cooperation Act also applies to all children's authorities and children's services. So it is very much the case that they need to work together much more effectively. And when we're also looking at the pressure on resources and budgets, we don't have the luxury of not working together collectively. So I do think it is something that this committee very much supports, obviously, from what you say, but could play a very key role in driving. Obviously, from the CSCA, the commitment to the Children and Young People Strategy, 2020 to 2013, is live. That in itself as well is something I think that needs to be elevated in terms of the remit of the Department of Education, all departments, and could be driven more effectively by this committee as well. You'll be aware that that applies across all government departments as well in terms of the outcomes that we want to see for our children and young people. So it's absolutely vital that our MLAs get behind this and drive it.
Thank you for that. If I could just for one very quick follow-up, where we're always conscious that there's a big gap in terms of health with this in terms of SEND provision. So where would you see that sitting in terms of the Department of Health's role, and have you had engagement where you've been encouraging them to utilise the provisions in this Act to work alongside education?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the diagnosis and the data and the information sharing that has to be much more effective than it is currently. And we know there are different data and information technology services in both in education and health. There has to be a way that they can speak to each other more effectively. We've heard about, EDIS, we've heard about Encompass. Let's look at how we can get those two databases and those two information sharing systems together much more effectively, because if our schools are aware of the numbers of children that are coming into preschool and into primary one and in the transition years that we've mentioned, it would be much more effective if schools were able to plan on the basis of knowing the needs of the children who they're supposed to meet when they come into the classroom as well. We also need to look at health in terms of the SEND Act, because there is an obligation on the Department of Health to work much more effectively with education and delivering for children with SEND. So that's something else that needs to be teased out. You'll be aware that we will meet with health officials as well as the Health Minister, and that is always top of the agenda. And I think it has been one of those perennial problems, but it's not been cracked. But I think we really need to tackle this urgently, as the Commissioner's already said, in terms of some of the other issues. I do think that the Children and Young People strategy, which is an executive-owned strategy, needs to be given the weight that it deserves. This is for our children and young people. It's a 10-year strategy that says we want to have successful outcomes for our children and meet all of their needs. How do we do that if our executive isn't driving that forward more successfully? I do think, and we've said this before, the Children and Young People strategy is the PFG for children, and we don't serve our children well if we're not implementing that effectively.
Could I just add very briefly, early intervention, and I know there's been a lot of discourse, a lot of discussion in the Assembly about an early learning and childcare strategy. Every meeting that I go to, almost every meeting, points to the need for early intervention, and it points to the need to think about a new funding model, to think about how resources are deployed or allocated to children in the earliest stages of life. And so we would talk about early intervention, and what we're seeing is a lot of undiagnosed need, a lot of in terms of speech and language, dyslexia, other areas, and we need to think about prevention. I know these words are sometimes used loosely, but prevention is where I would be recommending that we need to put our resources, but early intervention is key to that, and it's key that we get the learning and childcare strategy right as part of that discussion.
Thank you. And like I promised members, I wasn't going to hog this. So, Deputy Chair, are you wanting to come
Thanks,
to this
Chair. Falcher you said, Chris, in your presentation that we need to protect the most vulnerable children in society.
Yep.
Given the disgraceful cuts that happened last year, and you mentioned a couple of them, Healthy Happy Minds, Holiday Hunger, the Engage programme and so on, and the debacle around the placements for children with special educational needs, do you believe the department is doing its best to protect the most vulnerable in society? Because all of those actions disproportionately affected those who are most disadvantaged and most vulnerable.
What I would say, my initial response would be that on the back of the budget situation, my office and I, even before I came into the office, it was something that the team were very aware of, that the cuts were disproportionately affecting those most vulnerable, and in particularly children and young people. So we've written to and in fact engaged directly with the Secretary of State, with permanent secretaries, and our advice to them at the time was to revise their equality impact assessments, because in our view those impact assessments didn't adequately consider age and adequately consider children and young people in how those budgets were handed down or distributed. So absolutely there could be more done to protect those most vulnerable, and I suppose when we're looking forward to the new financial year, it's really important that discussions are happening now with regard to the budgeting process, and I would call for transparency as to how budgets are being set and how children and young people's needs are being assessed in the setting of budgets. I don't know if either of my colleagues would like to comment.
Just to add to that, actually, one of the most important things we think that can be happening, and it has been something that we've been working on for some years now, is child rights impact assessments. Because if we're looking at the needs of a child from the outset, and we do actually mitigate those potential pitfalls, then I think we can actually do our children much better service in terms of making sure that we meet their needs effectively. As Chris has said, the EKIAs that were carried out were concerning just because they weren't comprehensive enough, and some of the mitigation measures were not mitigation measures. We would hope, come back to your original question as well, that going forward the additional budget that has been allocated as a result of the money coming across from Westminster will target more effectively the most vulnerable children and young people. and reinstate the programmes that you've mentioned as well. If we're looking at the mental health and wellbeing of our children, we need to reinstate Healthy Happy Minds. If we want our children to be education ready, we have to make sure we reinstate the holiday hunger programme as well. And I'm aware yesterday the Assembly had a debate around school uniform costs. The costs of education generally are too high. So we need to look at what we can do to support our parents and families to make sure their children can engage in education effectively.
Well, I actually believe that those programmes that were cut shouldn't actually be outside of core funding. All of that wraparound support should be part of core funding, because the excuse given for those cuts was that the department didn't have a statutory obligation to fund those programmes, which I think is a disgrace. But in any event, focusing specifically on SEN for a moment, I mean, you've done a lot of work, Chris, as you've said, around that issue, and you've identified a lot of the failings. My concern is that when policies are being developed by government agencies or bodies, department or so on, they don't seem to be engaging with young people, with their families, and people who are at the coalface delivering services. What's your experience in terms of that, the level of engagement that's taking place?
Yeah, it's a really pertinent question, actually. And in terms of stats, you'd think I'm counting stats, but I've engaged with well over 3,000 children and young people at this point in time. Several groups of parents, and the reason I'm giving you that data is because children and young people are saying themselves that they've been left out of the conversation. Parents are organising themselves in communities, distressed parents who are having to leave work, who maybe haven't received, their child maybe isn't in an appropriate placement, and in some circumstances is missing school as a result. As I say, I've met a plethora of mostly mothers, I should say, who are organising on a community level to try and support each other. And the feedback that I'm getting is that there's an apparent lack of communication between the parent and the education authority. Now, we have raised these issues directly with the education authority, and to be fair to them, they're taking on board our feedback. But I would agree that children and young people's voices need to be central to this discussion, as does the role of the parents. But I would hasten, like I said in my introduction, I'm viewing this issue as a crisis. I think it should be viewed the same way we viewed COVID-19, and the way we approached COVID wasn't perfect, but it did show that when there's a will, there's a way. And I know that we need more provision, we need more facilities. We also need to develop our workforce and invest in the people who are working with children with those most acute needs.
Absolutely. And just on this point, I'll let you in a second, Arlene. In terms of the issue with COVID, I mean, we were able to build hospitals out of nothing within a very short space of time.
Yeah.
And I can't understand why that can't be done for the most vulnerable children in society, the children who need placements in special schools, because there just isn't the capacity at the minute. Sorry, Arlene.
I just wanted. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, because I agree with that. I mean, the Nightingale hospitals was a good example of how we can build facilities quickly. Now, we wouldn't be suggesting that's a long-term fix, but we're in a crisis. And I have spoke with head teachers about this. I've spoke to parents. A lot of the time parents need respite. I've spoke to people in the voluntary sector about how they could potentially help meet that gap. But I agree with you, the point is well made, and I think that's probably a recommendation that the department need to consider. So sorry, Arlene, for cutting across.
Just in relation to your question, Pat, I think there has been increased efforts to engage with parents and children and young people in SEND issues. Whether it's enough is questionable, or whether the findings of that engagement is really reflected in the policies. I think more action needs to be taken there. The placements issue is a clear example of that. So we've seen it last year that parents really felt those who weren't allocated placements, there was just such a lack of engagement. And I think that's one area where we could potentially learn lessons this year. We know that there's a forthcoming placement crisis in September 2024. Parents are not going to be necessarily allocated placements for their children with a kind of significant delay. We have spoken to the Education Authority on this issue, and they have advised us that for those parents who won't be getting the news that they want, that they will be kind of initiating some form of wraparound support. We haven't actually had details of that, but I think it is important, you know, even in the context of constraints, to look at what can we actually do to support parents and really kind of ensure that they feel like they are suitably informed and they have a voice in the process.
Okay, thanks for that.
Cara, looking to come
Thank
in
you,
next.
Chair. I have two questions and I'll try and be as quick as possible. My question is just around, I know you had touched on there the importance of early intervention, and I'm mindful at the moment of the particular challenges facing children who have ADHD, with delays in assessments, of course, little support in the classroom, and also difficulty in accessing meds. I'm just mindful, is that something you're picking up on your end when you speak to young people? What can the department do better to support these young people who have this diagnosis?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot in there, but I think my default position on this issue is that children's support needs are not getting met adequately, and there absolutely is an issue with undiagnosed, underdiagnosis, or indeed unmet need, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. The issue of meds has come up again, and I'll invite my colleagues to talk on all of this. But in terms of what can be done, one of the issues we spoke with school leaders about recently was about how the education system is resourced, and potentially putting more resources at a primary and a pre-primary end of the system, because it seems that there's a disparity in how we fund different parts of our education system. I'm a strong believer, as I said earlier, in early intervention, and I think that needs to start. With parents, with mothers, with fathers, with babies, and if you remember, in the old days, we all had a red book and a health visitor, and I know some of those services have been cut back. You know, COVID, we saw a massive issue with COVID. But I think what can be done is the answer is to invest, to put resources in those early stages of life, so that we can meet children's needs more adequately. Would either Maria or Arlene like to add to that?
Just to reinforce what Chris is saying as well, we get a lot of complaints to our legal department, and as you'd expect, a lot of them will relate to special educational needs like ADHD and the lack of access to medication as well. Obviously the legal team take that up and action that as well. Going back to what can be done, and it goes back again to the Children's Services Corporation Act, we need to be diagnosing our children as early as possible, to avoid the misdiagnoses and the unmet need that Chris is talking about as well. But it's also the case that we also need to look at the role of health visiting, for example, and this is where I know health and education sometimes get together on issues like this, and it would be something that we need to look at in terms of the family and parenting support strategy, and how we define family support in health and from health's perspective, and how that can happen at the earliest stage. Chris and I met with a group of principals recently, and they were telling us some very concerning stories about having to go out to the homes of their pupils, whereas before it would have been health visitors or maybe health professionals going out. And they're taking that role on because they're so concerned at what's happening in their classrooms and their schools, and they're not getting to do the job they're paid to do as well, so they're not getting to the other job. It is very concerning, and as Chris said, it is a crisis, and it is something that we need to address urgently, because we're just storing up trouble and we're not meeting the needs of our children. And you imagine what happens to a child's educational career when time after time you're not meeting their needs and you're not intervening early enough.
I just have one more question, if that's all right. I recently met with ADDNI, and that's exactly what they've stated, and they do such fantastic work, but it's evident that the funding they're receiving is nowhere meets the demand and need. My final question is just around, I had attended the Youth Participation APG on Monday, and one of the topics was around youth homelessness. Now, I'd met a young man in my constituency office who has a special educational need, was coming up to just about to leave school and renting for the first time, and often what we do see is landlords can take advantage of young people, particularly young students. And I'm just mindful, is this something you're having conversations on, and is there a piece there that we can do to educate our young people on their rights when it comes to housing?
Yeah, again, an issue I could probably talk for hours on, but I'll try and keep it brief. Absolutely, housing and homelessness is a priority issue for my office and I. In terms of the bigger picture and some of how you might go about fixing this, we would be recommending that we have homeless prevention legislation. And the reason I say that is because currently the housing executive can only intervene once you become homeless. So once you're presented as homeless, that's when they have a statutory duty to intervene. If our legislation allowed us to support our most vulnerable, again back to some of the points we're making here, at pre-crisis stage, we could alleviate some of that stress. There are also issues in terms of the welfare system and benefits, and the reality is for many of our most vulnerable, you're worse off sometimes, particularly for people, when I'm thinking about single parents, for example, sometimes you're worse off in terms of the benefit system and working. I think we need to do more in terms of educating young people around financial capability and life skills. But in other parts of the world, there are really good models that work, including a direct cash transfer scheme, which has been rolled out in parts of the USA and in England as well, where it gives people a lump sum of money to manage for themselves, and that included in that is support systems that go around that person. But yes, I think to answer your question, homeless prevention legislation would be a good start. Support services for children and young people, which would include the role of the voluntary and community sector, who often provide essential support for the type of young person you're talking about, but whose services are sometimes viewed as discretionary, and they're the types of projects that sometimes suffer when cuts are being made.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your hard work. It definitely doesn't go unnoticed. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, apologies, that's my mistake. Danny was in way
Go
earlier.
Go ahead, Kit.
No,
honestly, we've been, Danny, you were the first to indicate it almost. So,
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in today. Just, I suppose, focusing on schools, and it would be a concern of mine is the attendance, especially around special educational needs. Kids then getting put into mainstream who should probably be in specialised schools end up in reduced timetables. Massive concern, but also attendance in general. Chris, seems to be down in the last number of years, seems to be a rise in that. Yeah. I'm just wondering what your view is on that. Is it maybe COVID related, and just again around special educational needs in the classroom?
My view on attendance is that there are a range of issues, there are a range of reasons why children and young people aren't attending or maybe haven't returned to school since COVID. Mm-hmm. We do know that it's an issue that's increasing. You know, the numbers of young people not in school, and you've alluded to some of them. Sometimes their placement isn't suitable. Sometimes it's better for the child to be at home. You know, in acute circumstances, it's sometimes better for the child to be homeschooled, and that's up to the parent and the education system to be working together. But the key thing in all of this is the support. The support the parents and children are getting or not getting. And my question is why. So we're presented with data from time to time as the numbers of young people not in school, but we don't always know the why bit, and that's the bit that we need to find out more about. The why bit can be bullying related. I met a parent last week who had to take her 2 young children out of school because of racism that they were suffering. I know that issues such as health related issues, could be mental health, it could be well-being, It could be that the placement doesn't meet that child's needs, and the issue of reduced timetables. I also met young people in the last week who talked about being marked absent from school, who lived in rural areas, and that if the transport infrastructure wasn't necessarily meeting their need, they were missing school or being late for school. So there's such a wide range of issues, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So what my office and I are recommending is that we get under the hood a little bit to try and understand the why. And it goes back to the theme of support services, early intervention, the role of the community voluntary sector, the role of an educational welfare officer, and how we need to invest further in those types of systems and approaches. Arlene, would you like to?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Chris says. We need those kind of programmes that have been withdrawn, such as Healthy Happy Minds, the reduction of nurture. There's so much unmet need that early intervention isn't happening. We've seen post-COVID children, particularly the most vulnerable, as Chris has said, whether that's due to special educational needs, previous experiences of bullying and so forth, where those needs, they're not getting the support that they need to attend school. I would strongly kind of call for, we have some data through the Department of Education, but as Chris says, we really don't know enough about the underlying factors driving increasing rates of school absences, and really specifically how those affect different groups of children. Some of those will be overarching, but there will also be specific kind of interventions needed. The Education Welfare Service, we know there's a huge waiting list for that service. There has been a bit of a narrative, I would say, that there's a sense of complacency among parents, for example, which is driving increasing rates of school absence. I completely disagree with that. I would say there's obviously a variation of experiences. Most parents want their child to be in school. That school environment has to be a safe place for them where their needs can be met. I think, with the waiting list of the Education Welfare Service, there's not enough support in place for children and young people, and there's also not enough support in place for parents who are struggling to get their child into school. There's a whole host of issues. There's safeguarding issues. If a child isn't in school, where are they? Are they safe, or are they somewhere else? So I think one of our main kind of calls on this would be we need to look at it much more closely and really kind of get that detailed qualitative data to kind of get into the kind of underlying reasons and so forth.
One more would be, Chris, it would be remiss of me if I didn't bring it up, but it would be around the community and voluntary youth provisions and the funding model. Just wondering on your view on it. I know we're going back a wee bit when they removed it from 136 down to the 98, I think they get now to run the youth club. There's issues right now with specifications. There's going to be a bit of a 4-week funding gap that's going to happen because specifications won't come out the next week, and it'll not be late probably to the start of May, so we're going to be missing April. And the crux of why I'm bringing this up as well is around special educational needs provisions within youth work as well, because when you see the specifications come out, it is a part that then it's the community and voluntary sector apply for. It's for me it should be separate. There should be a funding there specifically for special educational needs, and almost not cutting the pie up more, because you're seeing it on again it falls into poverty as well, like the importance of having an anti-poverty strategy. And I think I spoke to you when we were out in St. Columb's a wee way back, one of your first visits, was we're even seeing it on the ground is when things sort of kick off. Hunger or poverty's behind us. When we get them into the clubs and stuff and get the pizzas ordered, it can calm things down. But that's, for me anyway, I find the driving force in some of what ends up being behaviour that goes onto the street could end up going through the judicial system as a result of this, which end up causes even more money, costs more money, and we've seen specifications of like the detached team in West Belfast being completely removed for the sake of £100,000. So just your view on the model of the farming sector.
And thank you for raising it, Danny. The first thing I would say is that I am concerned that we're not hearing enough from the Assembly at the moment about poverty. We absolutely need an anti-poverty strategy, and I listen a lot to all the current affairs and as much of the assembly questions as I can. And I would urge that we raise that issue more, because it is a driver for many of the issues that we're talking about. In terms of youth work funding, the current model, in the current model, you've got around £30 million for youth work delivery. £20 million of that goes right back into the Education Authority. So that leaves £10 million. Now, you would always argue for more, but I believe that we can do better with what we've got. The new funding scheme for youth, which was published a number of years ago, had a massive detrimental impact on the voluntary youth work sector. And there are many groups that are not in receipt of funding. What I'm being told is that the process is overly bureaucratic. There's an onus, there's a push from the Education Authority to a prerequisite to receive funding is that you must be registered. And that registration it's just another layer of bureaucracy. Moderation visits, I've been told, are sometimes way too frequent. And lots of young people and communities are telling me that the current offer within some of the statutory youth provision does not meet needs. So, for example, a lot of the time the statutory youth provider will cater for younger children, which is great. That's absolutely needed, and I'm not knocking the service or the people providing that service at all. What I'm asking for is more parity. And I know that the Department for Education are reviewing the funding policy and the priorities for youth. But it's back to that question about how we engage young people in that discussion, how we engage people who are left out of that funding scheme in that discussion, and undo some of the damage that has been done. And a lot of this relates back, a lot of the issues we're talking about here, as you will all know, voluntary and community sector providers often pick up the pieces. And that can be for children, young people, older people, parents, and it's often the voluntary and community sector that lose out. So yesterday I met with NICFA just to talk about, what they're doing, and they're working on a new Concordat, which hopefully will be tabled in the Assembly at some stage. But I would argue that we need a new funding model and a new funding relationship, and that would include multi-year budgeting. So I know there's a lot in that answer, but it's really important that the voluntary sector and the voluntary youth work sector is adequately resourced to meet the needs of young people.
Thank you. It is now your turn to come in.
And I just have one question as well. I was horrified to learn recently at how statements are so often wrong, that the name and the details, date of birth, even diagnosis are wrong, and it's not something that happens occasionally. It seems to be endemic. Are you aware of this, and what is your assessment from a child's right perspective?
Yeah, would any of you like to lead on?
Yes, it's a short answer. Kate, we're very much aware of that, and that issue's been raised with our legal team for quite some years now. We've obviously raised that with the Education Authority, who have the responsibility for delivering on statements. But from a child's rights perspective, you're not meeting the needs of that child and you're not respecting the rights of that child. And obviously, without quoting chapter and verse of the UNCRC, you'll be aware of all the relevant articles in there that would apply here, as well as domestic legislation in terms of the rights of children in education. It is something we have addressed, and also with the department, just in terms of the policy side of the house, because it's very important that they also influence the improvements that need to be made. And we're aware that there is the SEND transformation programme that is ongoing at the minute with DE and EA. A lot of these issues have been raised, and obviously through the work that we've done with our Too Little Too Late report, we addressed that issue back in 2020 formally through our report. There is a lot of work to be done around SEND transformation, as we all know, but we also have to meet the needs of our children now, and we have to make sure that we are as accurate as we need to be when we're developing statements. We know there's a lot of work that's going on concurrently, if you like, in terms of how we transform the SEND system. And if we transform it in a way that is child's rights compliant and meets the needs of our children, then we'll all welcome that. And this is why Nikki, for example, is involved in the various transformation programme boards to advise on that in line with our remit. But we are aware that that is still an issue that is happening.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think as Maria says, our legal team would be dealing with issues like this on a daily basis. So the process, we need to improve the process, and that process includes how we engage with children, both their parents. So parents going through that statement and process sometimes feel left in the dark. But I would also hasten to say that if we're providing support and the early intervention that we're talking about today, you shouldn't always need a statement to get the support that you require, I suppose is the point I'm trying to make. If we have the system right, and if we're investing in early intervention, if we're investing in the early years and children in primary schools and beyond that, you should be able to get the support that you need in schools regardless. Some schools are very good at it, I must say. Some schools are great at wrapping the support around the child, but that's variable, and it often is variable because of the strain on the educational budget.
Thank you.
So if three members still looking to come in. Kathy, you're next. Just conscious of time, so if we can keep, I don't want to shut discussion down, but just to keep answers brief as well would be great. And look, as I say, first of a number of engagements, I hope. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair, and I will keep it brief. Chris, could I take you back just to the early years in childcare strategy you had mentioned, and the issue of prevention and early intervention? I suppose I have a fear with the department at the minute that there's a lot of focus on 30 free hours of childcare, which we've, even as a committee, already heard the pitfalls, and less on actual affordability for parents, but on the actual quality for the child as well. And we've heard stories of children with special educational needs missing out on their nursery year, and that preparation for school. So early intervention just doesn't seem possible when they're not accessing those. I just want to get your view on what your feeling is from the department at the minute on the childcare strategy. Has there been engagement with yourselves around this, and do you get the feeling that it's an important issue for them?
In terms of our engagement with the department on it, nothing specific as yet, but we are due to meet with the minister soon, hopefully, and departmental officials. But I would just urge caution on. I think some of the narrative recently has been it's quite a populist thing to discuss right now, and I would urge that we do it right as opposed to do it quickly. I think there needs to be an onus. It sometimes feels like the onus is on the economy and getting parents out to work. I think the onus should be on that wraparound support, the early intervention. I keep repeating it, but it's based on the early intervention model. Like we've seen in England, some of the flaws in what they have tried to do in terms of offering a certain amount of hours. But I do think we need to have a very focused conversation on what that strategy should look like, and it should go beyond working parents. It needs to be, if you look at the Sure Start model as an example. So, why can't that be extended? Why can't we offer provision to include those most vulnerable as well as those who want to be economically active? But it's definitely something that we have a close working eye on, and we hope to have more in-depth conversations with the department on. Arlene and Maria, would you like to?
No, I'm mindful of time.
Okay.
Just to add that we've had initial engagement with officials around it, but as Chris says, we need to have the extensive engagement to be able to advise the department appropriately on this.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
David?
Thanks very much, Chair. Just on the Children's Services and Cooperation Act and the idea of the multidisciplinary teams and so on, it's something probably put the Children's Law Centre later, although they may cover it. In terms of the lack of implementation of that and lack of progress in that, what do you think has been the main obstacles there? Is it a siloed approach? Is it an idea of neither department wanting to take more responsibility that they don't have at the moment, or what do you think has been the main hold-ups there?
You want to go first?
Just because I caught your eye, David.
And also, have you had any engagement with the Department of Health around that as well?
We absolutely have, quite a lot, and we do this on a fairly regular basis. And I think one of the stumbling blocks to the CSEA has been the lack of weight and drive by the executive and by all the departments in taking this forward. And I do think there is an element of, particularly in budgets, when they're constrained, people tend to retreat to core business. And I think it's been quite difficult, particularly last year. But as Chris was saying earlier, the CSEA was passed in December 2015. We have not yet realised the potential of that. And the children and young people's strategy, again, is not being given the weight and drive that it deserves and needs as well. And I do think rather than developing more strategies, we need to focus on the one that we've got, that we spent a lot of time developing and advising on. And it is the case that I think that some people want to cooperate, but sometimes they're constrained, whether that's budgetary, whether it's because people are working in silos. So I do think absolutely much more could be done around that. And I do think the more that we talk to departments and the more that we've engaged with officials around this, a lot of people are saying, yes, we get that, but then we need that next step. We're also mindful as well, when we didn't have the executive in place, the monitoring report on the CSEA was held up. So we couldn't see that to advise on it. Now that there's a minister in, we're hoping to see that because we have to advise on the quality of that as well and what needs to happen for all the reasons you've just outlined, David, as well.
Robbie. Congratulations, Chris.
Thank you.
Really important job, as you know, that I would agree. So, and well done on hitting the ground running. So I'll just go straight to 2 questions. First question is in regard to the independent review into children's services and social care. Yeah. So I know that Nikki obviously ran with their own initiative report, which is the first of its kind, obviously, and was an incredibly good report. So in terms of looked after children and children in care, how will they factor in, and do you see value in the independent report and where that will fix in the transformation? And the second one, I'm going to be honest, I'm not giving you a bye ball here because we waste too much time, and Ray, you did speak into it just a minute or two ago. You guys can hold statutory agencies to account, and you do. However, this executive and this assembly has been grossly ineffective over this past 8 years. For 5 years out of 8, it hasn't sat. I don't think you guys have the power to poke the executive because they're kind of your employer too, in a sense. However, if you were to do an impact assessment as to the impact on young people and children when this place isn't running, I think it needs to be on record that we start to talk about it and deliver reports which indicates to politicians the impact on our children and young people and their opportunities in future. So if you want to address that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the first one on the independent review, I met with Ray Jones this morning and the children's, the collective of organisations that are working with him on the report, and the feedback that I've heard there's frustration that I suppose it relates to a lot of the reviews that have happened. There's an implementation block or stall. It seems that, and it's some of the young people involved in that report are saying, look, what's happening? You know, we've discussed this matter, and there's a little bit of apathy creeping in terms of the change that might happen, and the young people involved in the consultations are feeling that they'll not see in their lifetime the change that they've needed. I think there's something that we need to talk to the Minister for Health about with regards to that. Looked after children is a priority for our office. It has been for quite some time. I'm working with counterparts in across the Republic of Ireland, GB, and across Europe actually on this issue. And this year's network of ombudsmen and commissioners will host an event in autumn looking specifically at children in alternative care. But yes, I think we need action. It's like any of these reviews, reports, we need action to happen now. It needs properly resourced, and I'm hoping to talk to the Minister for Health about that. In terms of the absence of the Assembly, I would absolutely and wholeheartedly agree that in times of crisis, children and young people are the big losers. In terms of budgets, in terms of COVID, I mean we've had a decade of crisis after crisis, and the absence of the Assembly definitely has a detrimental impact on our children and young people. So I would hope that, I'm really hopeful, I'm really glad that the Assembly's sitting again I'm looking forward to working closely with all of its members and each of its committees, and I do believe that we can deliver. We can make an impact, and we can make the changes that are needed. So I'm not sure if Maria or Arlene want to add to those comments.
I suppose just very quickly, you mentioned about Nicky's role and powers in holding government to account, and that is essentially the role of the Commissioner's office. And to do that, you have to have a government in place. But it is very much the case that I know that Chris is very keen to look at not just the duties of the office in terms of what we have to deliver on, but also the powers of the office as well. And let's hope we don't have to exercise those too freely. We would like to think and work cooperatively, as Chris said, with the executive and all the departments to make sure that we deliver for children and young people, because there are times when we have to be honest and hold our hands up and say we have failed our children and young people.
Thank you. We're doing well for time, so I think it was a good job, everyone, and apologies if that was in any way rushed for you. We do hope to engage in much more detail. I'm going to finish with one final question. We have the Minister before us in a couple of weeks. We have officials in front of us today covering all sort of whole broad range of education policy. Really short takeaway, what would be your message that you would want to land with the Minister in terms of what needs to be his number one priority in this mandate?
Well, right now, in this moment, it's special educational needs, and I think that, as we've discussed, it needs to be addressed as an emergency. We need to think about the Nightingale approach and how COVID was approached. So I would be urging that the Minister move quickly in terms of that, including resources. The other issues we've discussed include the children and young people's strategy, how it's monitored, its impact, and how we work across departments. Like we've discussed, we need to monitor, we need to find out, we need to get sight of the report that Maria alluded to in terms of the Children's Services Cooperation Act.
Really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, can I just add to that, Chris? I can't speak for the Commissioner, but I would definitely emphasise special educational needs. I strongly feel that children and young people with special educational needs, to generalise, they're failed at every single point of the educational journey, whether that's early years, throughout primary school, post-primary school, in terms of the unmet needs, the access to services, provisions, their transitions into adult life. We've talked about homelessness, access to health services, their access to youth services and youth groups. In our engagement, we've heard of a lot of barriers. If we look at the kind of data on, the labour market outcomes, the poverty outcomes of adults with disabilities, that trajectory is really kind of depressing. So I think, it's an area that definitely needs to be prioritised.
Thank you, Arlene.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And
Thank you very much.
We'll meet again soon, no doubt.
We will see you soon.
So while we're just, the Children's Commissioner are leaving the committee room, can I just check in terms of actions that were agreed there? I think one of them, I just want to check that members are agreed that we do, in our forward work planning, take a thematic approach to our engagement with the Children's Commissioner and draw out some of those key areas of priority to ensure that they are feeding into the work of the committee going forward. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Before we bring our next witness in, can I just check, are members ready for a comfort break now, or do we want to run through to this next session? Keep going, that's great.
Yeah, keep going.
Anything else arising from that?
No, I mean, do members want to write to the department about the highlights of that briefing? Yeah. I think it was quite good.
Good job.
Did you want to commission research as well?
Yeah, I would just, before we bring Rachel in, it had also occurred to me there, Children's Services Cooperation Act came up quite a bit in the evidence. Would members be agreed that a research paper from RAISE might be helpful for the committee, just to, particularly for newer members who weren't in the Assembly when that legislation went through, to be clear on its provisions and how possibly it can be better utilised in the educational sphere? Members agreed?
Agreed.
It's often probably for planning, but whether we need to get officials from the Department of Health in to discuss that sort of interface with education.
Absolutely. If you could note that, and we'll come
Yeah.
to that later then. Thank you, David. That's helpful. Okay, so that brings us on to item 5 on the agenda, which is the Children's Law Centre. So there's a briefing paper from the committee clerk at page 17, and then there were also in tabled papers, there was a briefing, a couple of briefing papers provided by the Children's Law Centre, so I would refer members to both of those. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Rachel Hogan from the Children's Law Centre, and Rachel is the Special Educational Needs representative there, and I'm sure all of us, without exception, will have utilised the services of the Children's Law Centre at constituency level when we're dealing with casework in relation to special educational needs in particular. So it's great to have you here, Rachel, and you are very welcome. As with all our witnesses today, we're saying a presentation time of up to 10 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions from members, and if members can just indicate to me if they do want to come in. So on that, I'll hand over to you, Rachel. You're very welcome.
Very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you here today on this very important topic. The Children's Law Centre is an independent charity, and we provide free legal advice and information, and in some cases strategic legal casework for children with special educational needs, and in relation to any matter for an under 18 that might have a legal aspect. We have a lot of cases on respite as well at the minute. Those are the two big areas, is education and health and social care just currently. In your packs there you have a written submission, and I've given you also a case study called Alana's story, which I'll speak to briefly. I've also given you a short briefing on the Children's Services Cooperation Act, which seems to be in great fashion at the moment. Everybody's talking about it, but do we know what it means or what we can actually do with it? So we've tried in that briefing to give you a bit of an overview of what it does and what it's capable of, and what we should be thinking about when we want to use it, which I'll talk about briefly. And I've also included a briefing that went to all MLAs on the recent send motion that had been brought. So we have that available there to you. And we'll put that up on our website for anyone listening who wants to see that. We'll make sure that everybody can access it. Just briefly, I wanted to mention a couple of quick statistics. There's been a new statistical release that went out just hot off the press from the department, the NISRA statistics on special educational needs, just so that we can sort of see the profile of the young people that we're talking about. We have over 68,200 children with special educational needs on the register. That's 19.2% of the school population, so quite a significant percentage. 27,000 of those have statements of special educational needs, and over 41,000 are in schools without a statement of special educational need. So about 40% of children and young people with special educational needs have a statement, and about 20,000 children are in mainstream and 7,000 in special schools. So the majority would be in a mainstream school. We've recently seen a proliferation of specialist provisions in mainstream school, which have popped up to put a stick and plaster over the fact that there's no places for children with specialist needs. And there are currently 3,800 children in SPIMS, as they're called. That's an increase of 650 on the previous year. So I think we can see the trajectory where more and more children with special needs that are more complex are being educated in mainstream schools. And we have 7,200 in special schools, as I've said. That's an increase of 260 on the previous year. Approximately 19% of children and young people who have statements in mainstream are therefore now in specialist provisions in mainstream, or these pop-up classes. I don't want to be disrespectful, but in some respects pop-up classes, they haven't been planned, but they're more of a crisis reaction. And I think there are mixed reviews. Some are doing very, very well and people are very happy with them. Others we're not getting such good reports on. And I think we really need to evaluate and look to see, are these working well, and do we want to go down that path? That's one of the questions we might need to check in with the Education Authority and the department. Another statistic just to state here is that on free school meals we have 95,000 children and young people, and they're disproportionately represented in special schools. And I think, as we'll all know from our work, the parents of children with the most complex needs are very often the ones living in poverty, because it costs so much more to raise a child with a disability. In the briefing paper, I have focused at the top of that and at the outset on disability discrimination in education. And the reason I've done that is because I always find that disability is at a footnote, and it's at the end of every paper, and it's even at the end of the revised code of practice that's sitting on a shelf at the minute. And I think disability needs to come to the front page of everything that we're talking about. We had predicted that if the resourcing situation continued as it was, and if the unmet need continued as it was, that we'd start to see more disability discrimination. And we are indeed seeing that, where schools are more reluctant to take children with more complex needs because they don't feel they're going to get the support from the education authority to put all the resources in place. Or they just feel they don't have the know-how and the specialist capability to meet those children's needs. Or in some cases, they feel that these children, in inverted commas, don't belong in our school. So there's a bit of an attitude problem around disability, and there's a really serious issue with discrimination in schools. The way I would put it at the moment is that disabled children's human dignity, potential and self-worth are being trampled underfoot. An inclusive education system requires significant and sustainable investment. If the Department of Education continues down the path that it's currently on, which is that we should have inclusion in our schools, and that's the policy, and that's the legislative intent, with which we would agree, incidentally, of course there should be inclusion. It needs to be properly resourced and funded, and it needs to be sustainable. Jumping across to the attendance issue, the attendance figures are absolutely shocking by anyone's estimation. We have about 96,000 children and young people who have chronic to severe chronic attendance figures. So they're not attending school, up to 20% non-attendance. We have another 100,000 who are at risk. So we've got nearly 200,000 children with attendance issues in a school population of about 340,000. We have got a serious problem with school attendance. The Children's Law Centre takes the view that we need to find out from the people who aren't attending why. So we would agree with what the Children's Commissioner has said. We need to dig down. We need to look and see, disaggregated by Section 75 protected groupings. Is this disproportionately affecting disabled children? Children with special educational needs? I suspect it is. But it's affecting more than that, because that's a huge proportion of our school population. In our casework, we've been trying to track the reasons for it, and there are so many different reasons, but they all come back to unmet need. Need that hasn't been identified early, or if it has been identified, no one has done anything about it. And it tends to be that it's the most vulnerable families, those in poverty, those with socioeconomic deprivation, parents who haven't themselves had a good education, children who really want to go to school, really want to go to school, and they can't get there because they've got no transport, or because there's no one there to carry out a medical procedure. And they're sitting at home in floods of tears, watching everybody else go. I've mentioned two children out of the many that we have served. I've given you a case study of a child who we've called Alana. There's an anonymity order out because it went to a High Court application for leave for judicial review. And Alana has very complex special educational needs and medical needs. You would describe her as a child who needs intensive care at home 24/7 and in school when she's there. She's on a ventilator, she gets suction, she's looked after all the time to keep her safe and well and out of harm's way. She didn't get to go to school until primary 3. Now she's a compulsory mandatory entitlement to go to school. She should be in school. Her parents could be brought to court if they didn't bring her to school. The Education Authority failed to provide her with a suitable specialist transport provision. Her parents didn't have any transport. She wasn't able to go to school. She had a special school placement sitting there waiting for her, nurturing, lots of good activities that she could have been learning and developing with, and she wasn't able to get to school. The facts of it are quite complicated. It's around COVID and the possibility of infection, but ultimately nobody looked at the child. They were looking at everybody but the child in the risk assessment, and she missed all of that valuable education. In that case, we got declarations from the High Court that her human rights had been breached. She didn't get her arrangements under a statement. She didn't get the right to education. And incidentally, when a child is not in school for any reason, the Education Authority has a duty to arrange alternative education provision of some sort. So all of these children that we're talking about that are out of school for a length of time, there's a duty under Article 86 of the Education Northern Ireland Order 1998 to make arrangements at school or otherwise than at school for those children to be educated. If a child has a statement, obviously there's even more of an onus to make arrangements under the 1996 Education Order. I have another child that I want to mention to you, and this child is a very special young woman, a 12-year-old girl, and her name is Aurelia. And her words to me last week were, I want the government to know my name. So we're not using an anonymity, we're not using a fake name. We could have chosen any name we wanted. No, her name is Aurelia, and she is a very, very talented and very smart and insightful young woman. She happens to have cerebral palsy, and she is a wheelchair user, so she uses an electronic wheelchair. And when it came to transfer year 8, she was very excited like everybody else. She'd been to a mainstream primary school all her life and couldn't wait to choose her school. She was told she could choose her school because she had a statement. So she put forward her local school that all her friends and all were going to, and that one of her brothers attends. And it turned out, in her words, they wouldn't let me go there. She chose a second school where another sibling attends, one that she's familiar with. She's been there on the open day. She's been down all the corridors in her wheelchair. She's seen all around it. They wouldn't let me go either, she said. And she said what hurt me the most was that they didn't even try. She said, I think all they needed was probably a small ramp and a few adjustments. I needed some adjustments. And it really hurt me that they didn't even try. And the Education Authority, she said, they tried a bit, but they didn't fight. They didn't fight for me to go to my school. And everybody else was celebrating. They were celebrating their school, my school. But I had nothing to celebrate. I was sitting there, I had nothing to celebrate. And I cried and cried and cried. And she did cry. And last week she cried and she cried and cried and sobbed, even though she is now at school with the hurt that this has caused. Why am I telling you all of this? I really want us to start thinking about the children. These are not numbers, they're not statistics, they're not policy, they're not process. They are human beings with feelings and potential and ability that is being wasted and walked over. They're not second-class citizens. They're just as good, if not better, than everybody else because they've had to fight harder for every gain that they've made. So we need to start looking and focusing our efforts and resources on outcomes, impacts and outcomes. We're spending money on X, Y or Z. What difference is it making to Aurelia? Now that child's father, from late 2022, started to look for a school place for her. He was extremely proactive. The educational psychologist was extremely proactive. The occupational therapist from the Health Trust couldn't have done more. And yet we were sitting in a position in the middle of July when St Genevieve's High School got a draft statement onto their desk and said, this is your pupil now. And they came back from their summer holidays in the middle of August and said, what's this all about? No one had thought, well, hold on, Aurelia needs a hoist and a changing bench, and she needs room for a wheelchair and a personal assistant who's trained in intimate care and moving and handling. And she needs an adjustable desk, or 3, for the school, and she needs a laptop, and she needs to have an induction, and she needs to know all the other children, and she doesn't need to sit wearing a pull-up in the class. She needs to have a bathroom, like all of us have a bathroom, and we can access it easily. This is the level that we have actually sunk to in our education system. This is an easy case. This child was in primary school for 7 years, and we could see her coming. And she gets a draft statement in the middle of July. By the time I got it in early September, she still didn't have a final statement. She did then get a final statement when we intervened, but she still wasn't able to attend. So we had to get a solution of getting temporary equipment, temporary hired hoist, a hired changing bench. All of that could have been done 6 months ago. That temporary solution is now in place, and Aurelia is now in school. And you'd think, well, hey, happy ever after. That's great. Tick. No. Aurelia has to now start from scratch, getting to know every single teacher and every single child and how to get around all of those months that everyone else had to figure it out and get stressed about it. She's there. She's missed 4 months of work. She's very conscientious. She wanted to do that work. She feels that she's missed out on that work. She is one determined lady, and she said, if you're talking to any other children, just tell them to believe in themselves. I wish I had tried harder to sort this out, she said. I wish I could have thought of something else I could do to be with my brothers and be with my friends. She's not with her brothers and she's not with her friends, but she has a very good school in St Genevieve's, and they have opened their doors and they're trying very hard. And they have said that they're privileged to have her and honoured and happy to have her. And they'll fight, and they're fighting now for resources. They're going to need a toilet block adapted. We're still waiting for confirmation of all of that. So that's one child that I'm dealing with at the minute in the Children's Law Centre, and all of our workers are flat out dealing with children with very difficult situations. We've also got families, it'll be the same families that aren't getting respite or are in poverty, and have children with challenging behaviour, maybe at home all the time, and they're getting beaten up black and blue and bitten and having their house destroyed, and everyone thinks it's someone else's problem. And this is where the Children's Services Cooperation Act is so important. And I won't go through the briefing because time is very short, but essentially I think one of the solutions to that is that the Department of Finance has regulation making powers in order to put financial structures in place. And if you don't have financial structures and rules and regulations and controls in place, how do people know what they can do, what money they can pool, and how they can then share that out? Pooling isn't just for money, it's for people and equipment. Could we have got that equipment somewhere else quicker for Aurelia if we had some kind of a pathway? So I think my message today is that we need to start looking at children and the outcomes for them and really focusing down on pathways. If we have 2,000 children, and I'm just plucking a figure out of the air, if we have 2,000 children with unmet need, and we know they're sitting there, we need to find out 5-10 paths that we can send them down. It's not necessarily a statement on a classroom assistant, but there's really nothing else there at the minute. So I think it's about pathways and solutions, and that's where all the money and effort and time should be, not up at the top somewhere paying big wages to managers to come up with fancy words and documents, but action and outcomes. Now, my understanding from the department is that is also their focus at the minute, is actions and outcomes, and why are we doing this and what's it for, and I would welcome that, and I think it's high time we got there.
Thank you, and Rachel, it's really do appreciate you here, and I think hearing those individual stories it's so impactful, and I think every single one of us will have sat with parents and children and young people hearing similar stories in our constituency offices, and I think we would all agree around this room it's unacceptable and it can't continue. But if you can pass on our thanks to Aurelia and Alana anonymised for allowing those stories to be shared, because it really does help us in terms of our thinking on these issues. We are quite tight for time, and I imagine a lot of members are going to want to come in here, so I'll be brief, and I'm just going to pick up again on the Children's Services Cooperation Act. It's what I raised with the Children's Commissioner. Could you just give us a little bit more detail on just practically how you could see that working out, where the potential areas of cooperation between education and health are, and specifically how you would see finance having a role in terms of that pooling of resources? I think it would be helpful just in terms of what we talk about cross-departmental working and to ensure early intervention, but it can feel like a bit of a hamster wheel that just goes round and round. So it would be good to get a wee bit more detail on your thinking on how that might work.
We have to start somewhere, and I think the first port of call would be, well, what are we already doing? And I think that could be mapped out easily enough. There are some small pockets of good practice across, for example, education. I think it's important to say, though, this is a collective responsibility. This is not just an education issue, and it's not just a health issue. There are lots of other departments that can be helping. For example, the Department for Communities is working on a disability strategy, and I've just told you about the lack of awareness of disability issues. So we have to look to everybody in the executive and say, what are you going to contribute to this? We have to invent it from scratch. It's new. We have to start somewhere. So map it out. What have we got so far? And where are the areas where we could cooperate more? Now, to give you an example, the EA SEND transformation projects had their funding cut by 50% when that horrendous budget was set for last year. And the department was sitting looking and saying, we have to make cuts. What have we got to cut? And as we said earlier, certain things weren't within core, they weren't protected. Things that should be protected, that should be, equality-based spending, were not protected. So they cut that funding, and that has then meant that the multidisciplinary teams that were planned for EA transformation to provide the early intervention. So you'd have all of the EA pupil support services like literacy support, behaviour support, autism support, psychology, etc., etc., etc. You'd have all of those, and also you'd have allied health professionals like OTs, physio, speech and language, They could be integrated teams, and they could be available to schools to provide expertise and in a local area, build up a relationship and get in there and work with the children. Once that money was cut, there was no resource for health, and now we're down to local integrated teams is the name of it now. So you'll notice it's not multidisciplinary, it's local integrated, EA only. That's not right. That's a half-baked approach. These children have been so horrifically let down. I've listed the reports, some of the reports. Over 10, 12 reports sitting on the shelf now. They've been horrendously let down, and they've had their human rights breached. And that's not no small matter. That is a huge issue for someone to have their human rights breached. So we need to really start to think about how are we going to fix this properly, and a half-baked approach isn't good enough. We need to put plenty of money, resource, time and effort from all relevant departments into how we cooperate to make this better for the children. Another example I just want to give you as well is that there's been a lot of work done by the department, Education and Health have been working on this, on restrictive practices. There's been a lot of debate about restraint and seclusion is the term that would often be used, and parents have shone a light into dark corners in this committee before. Restrictive practices is a complex legal area, and it's a place where staff need support and they need guidance, and guidance has been drafted and consulted on, and CLC has responded, and we're not entirely happy with it. The Department of Health, first of all, produced guidance in 2021, which is quite good, and it sets out all the definitions of what is a restrictive practice, what can you do, what can you not do, and when do you need to go and seek lawful authority for deprivation of liberty or restricting someone's liberty. But it only covers health and social care. So we had said at the time, that should cover education as well, at least. It should cover everywhere where a child is. Their protection should be the same, no matter what the environment. So the Department of Health didn't do that. Education then comes along, and the departmental officials are sitting trying to draft restrictive practices guidance for education. And really what needs to happen there now to get this fixed, to protect education staff and children in education, is that health and education have got to sit down together and make sure that these two pieces of guidance match up. Because you've got workers in those environments. For example, you've got health workers in education. Which one do they follow? So it needs to be, matched up, and the definitions need to be the same. Those are just a couple of small examples. And the Department of Finance, I think, needs to come right into the room and have a think about, what could we do to make it easier for people to pool? And that could be government departments, arm's length bodies, community voluntary. People can put money into a pot and then they can draw from it. If we share our resources, we've got more money. And if we work together, we're not duplicating. And we all know what's happening. Sharing of data, that everybody knows what's happening to the child in education, in health, in social care. We don't have any it's apples, oranges and pears. There's no comparison across. We don't know how many disabled children we have. Let's count them across health and education using our systems. There's just any number of different ways where you could start. But I think it needs to have a strategic focus. And I get the feeling that there's a will to do that from what I'm hearing people talking about. So I hope that can be taken forward. We're happy to help in any way we can.
Thank you for that. I just want to pick up really quickly on restraint and seclusion, because I think it's a really key area, and we haven't covered it in detail in this mandate as yet, although we are in early days. I had a meeting with the Royal College of Nurses recently, and I know that they are very concerned that there's not enough crossover between health and education on this, and they are very concerned that the guidance that could emerge from the Department of Education may have huge gaps in terms of its human rights compliance. Would you be of the view that there maybe is space to pause the publication of that guidance to get this right?
It has to be paused until it's right. In its current form, it's not fit for purpose. And that's not to be overly critical. People have worked very hard to try and draft that guidance, and I've been on an advisory group with others in relation to it. But we have been saying from the beginning, you need to work with health on this. And the feeling is there's just a lot of barriers to that really true joint working. And I think that the Royal College of Nursing is very willing to support, and we've been talking to everybody around this. And I think that they have expertise, they have this in practice, so they really understand it really well, and they could really help. So there has to be space for them to collaborate and work through the difficulties and get it right, because it would be nothing worse nearly than putting out something in the meantime that's wrong. However, this is quite urgent because the legal rights are live. So the Human Rights Act is obviously on the books. So if you deprive someone of their liberty or restrict them in some way, using a restrictive practice like a hold, and you've done that in an unreasonable fashion without a good reason, then you could find yourself liable. On the other side of that, can we please have common sense? We don't want schools flying into a panic. If a child's about to run across the road in front of a car, of course it's okay, and it's proportionate to stop them from doing that. So schools need reassurance. I think they're very exercised about this. There has been a High Court action in relation to a child which has precipitated this debate, and it has just shown that gap between health and education. There is some joint work in there and joint conversations. It needs to be built up to a much greater degree, and maybe there's room there for some kind of a permanent structure, because various issues are going to arise, that we're not doing this on a piecemeal way, but that we do it, we always have that joint work in place.
For that. Deputy Chair, you were wanting to come in?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Rachel. I'm going to ask you probably an unfair question.
Nope.
In the context of all the cuts we talked about last year and the 50% reduction in the SEND transformation programme, if you're a young person at one of the grammar schools, for example, in the leafy suburbs, and no disrespect to any of those schools, but if you're a young person there and you have no special needs, you wouldn't have been affected at all by any of those cuts. Your education wouldn't have been affected in any way. But the most vulnerable children in society, those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, those suffering from mental health or well-being issues, those who fell behind in their learning for whatever reason, and whether it's, they've been off school sick, the kids who are going into school hungry in the mornings, the holiday hunger stuff is cut and all of that sort of stuff. If you're making decisions around that, and we had officials in here last week telling us how difficult it was to make those decisions. Well, I don't care how difficult it was for them. It was far more difficult for the families and the children when those cuts were made. So how can you, and I'm asking you to answer a question you probably can't answer, how can people make those decisions that they know, there's no doubt about this, they know are going to negatively affect the most vulnerable children in our society?
I do know the answer to that, Pat. I know how they can do it. They can do it by failing in their equality duties. We have Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, which sets out, the equality groupings that we should be focusing our resources towards. So there is a mandatory duty to have regard to the need to promote equality of opportunity when making decisions about policy. So when budgets are being set and when budget decisions are being made, whatever level that's at, whether it's a departmental level, EA level and up and above, you have to look at the pot of money that you have and the group of people that you have to serve in your society. And if you're paying due regard to the need to promote equality of opportunity, then you will skew resources towards those most disadvantaged, possibly slightly away from the leafy suburbs, and towards those who are socioeconomically deprived, those with disabilities, children looked after, we've spoken about. You look for the disadvantaged groups and you actively target resources at them in order to bring them up, and that's a great equaliser. A great issue that we see in the Children's Law Centre across all departments without fail is that when we look at the policy development and we look at their equality screenings, we see that the equality screenings aren't up to par. And people seem to have a bit of a fear and a lack of understanding around their Section 75 duties. And I think from that point of view there is room for improvement so that officials feel really confident and they really understand how to apply Section 75 and why they're doing it. It's not some arduous, annoying tick box exercise. It has these impacts that you've talked about. One wee thing that I will pull you up on, some things cross the leafy suburbs, and mental health is a great equaliser, as so is disability. These can pop up everywhere, and I think when we look at our statistics we can see that these issues are everywhere. Just to sort of cross over again into the COVID debate, I've been speaking to a parent recently whose child was a first year student whenever COVID hit. So she was just getting into school and then out of school for that long period of time, and the social skills suffered and all the rest of it. Now she's trying to sit GCSEs and she's so crippled with anxiety she can't go in. There's a whole cohort of children, I wonder are these attendance figures linked to this, we don't really know, that are sitting GCSEs now that were COVID children. And what are they getting? So are we targeting money? No, we took money off them as well. So I think, Pat, you're absolutely right. We need to look carefully at how we target resources in order to carry out the policy intent. And when we're screening to see if we're going to have the right sort of impact, that we use proper data, collect that data and analyse it effectively. So we don't just say there's X number of children in Northern Ireland and we're going to help them all with this policy. You say there's X number of children and Y of them have disabilities, and we think this policy is going to impact children with disabilities because you've got disability and you've got age. Maybe they're a newcomer child as well. So you have to consider all these different categories. So it's not complicated. You look at the effects across society that accumulate when you make decisions at a high level, and you work those down through into the low level decisions. I think that's just basic maths.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't disagree with a word of what you've said. I mean, the difficulty I find is that it's probably a mindset more than anything, that a permanent secretary, as was in charge last year, sees his primary statutory obligation to balance the budget and responsibilities under equality legislation is almost an afterthought. And I'm wondering, have you an idea how you change that sort of mindset?
Well, I'm not going to speak in too much detail around the budget, and the reason for that is that we currently have a legal action ongoing at the moment that is live in court. So anything I say can and will be written down and presented in court. So I have to be obviously careful about what I will say about that. But obviously at permanent secretary level, there was huge pressure in terms of making the budget work, and that completely overshadowed the other duties. For example, you could have taken the view that, well, if I make this cut now, in 6 months' time, a year's time, it's going to cost us an awful lot more. So it's not truly a cut, you're actually incurring a cost, which would have been against the guidance that was given to the permanent secretaries. So I don't think any of us would like to have been in the permanent secretary's shoes. There were difficult decisions. But I think, as you say, there were equality impacts that hadn't been thought through. It was trying to shut the stable door after the horses had bolted, shall we say. The money was gone and we were left with what do we cut? And there was nothing left to cut. And I think there's also something to be said about protecting money for those who need it most. So putting certain types of supports into the core budget, that it's protected. It can't be cut. You can't cut money that's helping disabled children or mentally ill children or children with various different diagnoses or waiting on a diagnosis. So I think, again, that's a collaborative discussion that has to happen across the executive, and I think they would be good. People are here finally back and they want to make a difference, and this is one of the ways they can do it, is to really look at the equality duties and the cooperation duties, and those two things work really well together.
Okay, thanks
for your question.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, so I think I've had an indication from every other member here, so we're really tight in time. So I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their question. If I could just ask that we keep answers really succinct, but it's been a really, really helpful session, so I don't want to cut it short unnecessarily. But the clock is ticking. Cheryl, if you want to come in.
Thank you, and thank you so much. I think we could probably all say quite a lot, but I know we're conscious on time. One of the things I have noticed is the high level of expulsions and suspensions for children with SEN. In comparison to those without. So is that something that you're seeing at the office at the moment? And how do you think we can move forward with that? I know it's a very difficult subject for schools and for parents and pupils. Your mention of actions and outcomes and data is essential. I know even at our last PAC, we had drawn on a number of issues in terms of the lack of data collection in Northern Ireland, and I think it's something that we need to start really looking at, and how would you feel that there would be the best move forward with that? Again, there was the Education Training Inspectorate, and they had established, I think that there was 27% of teachers indicated that they received effective training for working with children with SEN. Again, in terms of that training provision, do you feel it's adequate here in Northern Ireland, and what else can we do to make sure that there's a quality education and proper training for everybody?
That's 3 questions.
Sorry, I know.
all really good questions.
Not everybody's listening to me.
Those are all very relevant to the work that we do. In terms of the suspensions and expulsions, those are actually the tip of the iceberg. And there's obviously a duty not to discriminate against children when you make decisions, to exclude them from school. And there tends to be a trend of moving the child on to someone else, to be someone else's problem, and that, frankly, is an abdication of responsibility. And it does tend to affect children with behavioural issues more, psychosocial behavioural issues that often flow from the like of autism, which hasn't been properly supported, or from trauma. Sometimes looked after children who have, really difficult trauma that surfaces in teenage years. So there's usually, when you look at it, a really difficult dynamic behind that child's life. And when you look at it and you work your way back, you see that was starting to pop up in P2 or P3, and there was a bit of a problem in P4, but nobody did anything. So I think we'll have to go back to that early intervention piece, nip problems in the bud, and make sure there's a pathway there for that child to go down. It doesn't have to be a statement. It could be a social services support, etc., etc. Suspension and expulsions are the formal process. That's the tip of the iceberg. Then we've got all the children who are at home, who are not under any formal procedures and are not protected by law in any way, and are frankly invisible, which is a child protection issue. And we'll look at the numbers, we can see the level of that. So with children who've been told to go home early, or they're only coming in and doing half a timetable. I have a lovely client I'm dealing with at the minute who is hopefully going to be a famous author someday and remember me in her writings. And she had cut her timetable down to about half the subjects from everyone else. A year 8 transfer, post-COVID, anxiety, autism, not coping, overcrowded school has no resources, etc. Typical story that you're all familiar with from your constituency work. And I said to her, you're a very talented person. You're going to be a famous author. This school's very lucky to have you. Why are you only doing 5 GCSEs? Why has everybody else got a better opportunity than you? Everybody sort of stopped for a minute, because it was all about, well, protect the child and make the curriculum smaller. But you're taking away opportunities from a very intelligent girl. So you need to look at the reasonable adjustments. So the reasonable adjustments, resource and inclusion, resource and special educational needs, meeting the need, whatever it is, when you find it, whether you're the school, the education authority, the social services, whoever it might be. Parents obviously have a role to play. Children themselves have a role to play. It's a collective responsibility. Everyone needs to pull their weight. And there's organisations like the Children's Law Centre who are there to help you. If you're stuck, pick up the phone and we'll try and help to find the path, or make a path in most cases. The data question, absolutely huge issue. How can you do equality screenings without data? Who do we need data from? People who are affected. Who's affected in education policy? Children and young people, and probably their families and parents and caregivers as well, and siblings. So we need to put structures in place to consult children properly. The same poor 10 children are consulted about every policy that comes along. The department seems to be struggling a little bit to find a structure. And there are different organisations like the Secondary Students' Union and Departmental, and there's all these fantastic organisations. But there's, 340,000 school children out there. It's the Department of Education. There must be some access route to get those children to engage in civic responsibility and get them to volunteer information and data about their lives, and help them if they're being affected by a policy to have a say on it, and let them know that they do have a say and we want to hear from them. So data collection is critical, and also not just data but disaggregated data by protected group, and that's to meet legal compliance requirements. You'd mentioned the ETI and effective training. No, teachers are not getting effective training, and they say that to us all the time. Social workers would say the same actually, and other people as well. They need to have a good continuous professional development programme. There needs to be a mandatory element to it. Every teacher should be trained in disability equality and human rights. Every child should be trained in disability equality and human rights, so they can appreciate and understand their neighbour and have respect for themselves and others. So we need to put that into place. It's very easy to miss discrimination if you're not looking for it. It took me a long number of years to be able to just see it and look for it. Parents don't always see it either, because this is what they've come to expect, that my child will be treated like that. So there's a whole public discourse around equality that needs to happen so that we recognise people's rights. So rights-based training would be one, but there's also training for various different specific disabilities. Schools can always go out and get training during the year. There is training there, but does the teacher have time to go out and do it? Is the classroom assistant involved? Does the person working in the dinner hall know what to do? If a child with visual impairment comes along and can't see the food, are they ready for that? So I should have actually, when I was mentioned visual impairment, I actually should have mentioned the Equalise project that Children's Law Centre is on with Angel Eyes Northern Ireland, and it was Angel Eyes that referred Alana's case to us, so I just want to give credit for that where credit's due as well. Should have done that earlier. So I think that answers hopefully your 3 questions.
Thank you, and I'll not come back.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to bring Robbie in, and I'll just emphasise we're definitely in the question and answer territory now, 100%.
Yeah,
so
keep it short.
that's great.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Absolutely brilliant. I could spend all day with you. Genuinely could. Chair, I'm going to suggest that the committee write to Aurelia in particular, because Aurelia felt that people weren't listening, but this committee absolutely will be listening. So if we could agree that.
I think all members will agree that.
And I'd like to offer Aurelia, if she wants to visit Stormont, I'd give her a personal tour, because a young person like that who's shown such bravery in and around waving her right to anonymity is incredibly special.
Absolutely amazing, and I
So-
think she would lead the country someday, so
Well,
you could be honest with her.
I would say she would do a better job than some of us have been doing. So to my question, you've been very, very kind to those who have power. With finite budgets, absolutely, with finite resources. But you mentioned the push towards inclusion, but it seems to have come at the sacrifice to children availing of their rights in a way. And what's also occurring to me is that, yes, there was a greater number of young people with either a learning disability or statement or whatever last year, but that's the same amount of children that are there. So obviously the failure to be able to offer them a place in a mainstream school in this inclusive setting. So has the push to meet a strategic objective, which is inclusion, come at the cost and consequence of a diminution of children's rights?
Very, very good question. The policy of inclusion so far has failed. I agree with the policy. The policy is a good policy. Special Educational Needs and Disability Northern Ireland Order came in 2005, which was the first time that disability discrimination became unlawful in schools. Hard to believe it was that recent. And the strengthened right to attend a mainstream school came into being there as well. And children should be able to attend mainstream, and Aurelia is very strong on that. She absolutely demands to attend a mainstream school. That is where she sees herself that she belongs. And she has total respect for those that attend special schools as well, to each the place that they need to meet their needs. Inclusion will only work if it's properly resourced. A child should be able to go to their local school around the corner, regardless of their disability or their special educational need, but all schools are not equal. They're not equally capacitous in terms of their knowledge, their know-how, their physical spaces, their resources, their toilet facilities, their knowledge of autism, which is highly prevalent, and even things like dyslexia, ADHD, ADD, all of these things. And if you take a child and place them in an inappropriate placement and tick the box, that child is attending, they have a place, and yet they don't cope, and then they have to go home. What do they feel like? So we described Aurelia, and I haven't given you all the detail because it's too distressing, but actually there's children in that level of distress who think, I am not good enough somehow, I've been cast aside, everyone else must be better than me. All because inclusion hasn't been done well. So I think we need to look and see who is doing it well. Some schools are doing a fantastic job of inclusion, and they're a total shining beacon of light to everybody else. And it's not to even blame schools, because they are where they are because of the journey they've travelled. But we need to help them, we need to support them, we need to resource them properly. We need to maybe ask them what they need. Sometimes people are afraid to put their hand up and say, I don't understand my obligations or what the rights of these children are. So as I say, if people understand their own rights, they're more likely to ask for them. So if Aurelia understands her rights, she's more likely to say this isn't good enough.
And just to finish that out, would I be right in saying that, and because I've reached in with regard to an assessment of SPIMs, the ones that have been set up rapidly, and we all understand the context and the need for that, but would we be right to be paying a special focus in there to ensure that those
Yes, I think the SPIMs do deserve special scrutiny from the Education Committee. I'm so glad to have the Education Committee back to give this scrutiny. It's so vital. SPIMs might be the best thing since sliced bread. I really hope they are. I would say they're not all perfect, but we don't know. So it'd be good to see an evaluation.
Assisting them as opposed to waiting to scrutinise things that are falling apart and seen as a critical friend at this stage because they're just new.
And is that our policy? Yeah. Did we decide to do it?
Okay.
Or are we doing it because we have no other choice? And would we now decide to do it? Let's get ourselves back to the place where we're doing normal day-to-day operations and out of crisis mode, so we can make decisions and plan policies and get out of this situation of putting the finger in the dam and the dam's bursting. We have to stop this.
So really helpful, and I think that the SPIMs just keep coming back as a theme, don't they? So we do need to ensure that scrutiny is applied, and I think there seems commitment in the room to do that. I'm going to bring Kate in next.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I keep changing my question every sentence you say, Rachel. You're a brilliant presentation. Children's Law Centre has been fantastic in supporting asylum-seeking refugee children, and I know of some cases in particular that have really been life-enhancing, so I want to pay tribute to the work that you're doing. I am very concerned about children with special educational needs who are asylum seekers, particularly ones who are living in contingency accommodation and being moved about. And I guess in the context of the end-to-end review and the work that's being done at the moment, what particular outcomes would you like to see in this work, particularly for these newcomer children?
I think basically children are children and they all have the same rights regardless of where they came from or how they got there. And we have had some very complex cases, and it's my colleague Eamon McNally, solicitor, who has dealt with a lot of those. And it would be children with really complex disabilities, say wheelchair users as well, who are in a hotel and don't have an ability to get showered or can't access proper food according to their tradition and things like that, and even suffering from malnutrition, really serious cases. These are really vulnerable people who have a lot of trauma. And so we need to put the service in place to wrap the care around those families and children and make sure that they can experience equality, that they've come to this country to seek safety, that they receive the care that they require. And that, I mean, it's a bit more complicated to make the school placement decision, for example, because you don't know if that child's going to stay in that area, and there have been difficulties around that. We have found the Education Authority fairly responsive. There's a good will there, but I think we need to have the policies in place and to really, pick out that group and put focus and attention on it and make sure that there's enough expertise in the room to resolve it correctly, and that we listen to those families, obviously, to see what their needs are.
Absolutely, and it comes back to departments working together as well, because there is so much overlap.
Yeah, it's really
That's
cross-cutting.
Theme today.
Really cross-cutting, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kathy, I think you were next.
Thanks very much, Chair. Rachel, thanks very much. I just wanted to go back again to the childcare and early years settings, and we're aware that there's a serious capacity issue there, and specifically when it does come to children with special educational needs or disabilities. And I know personally of families who just don't think that childcare is an option for them because of the needs that their children have. It's just, I suppose, to quickly, to get your view on the sector and what needs to be done. Is there enough being done to try and make sure that provision is there for these children?
It comes back again to capacity building and equipping facilities to meet the needs of children with disabilities, and also that collaboration piece, but with a clear understanding of who is responsible for what. I think that's something we need to be careful about when we say everyone should cooperate and there's 10 people around the table and everyone thinks someone else is in charge. Mm-hmm. So I think there has to be a coordinating role in those complex cases. And again, we can predict that these children are coming if they're caught early in health and flagged up, and then there needs to be enough plan to have sufficient places, and also the service provider needs to understand their legal obligation. They're providing a service to children, and they can't just go, oh, that child has a disability, I'm not having that. That's discrimination, and it might be unlawful discrimination in some cases. So again, what I would say, if people are having individual issues with that, please do take advice, but on a planning level, it's making sure capacity is built, and that the children's rights are respected as disabled people.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
You were next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a really heartfelt and comprehensive overview of difficulties facing our young people, and thank you for the support that you and your team have provided MLAs. I know I've worked with you on a few issues regarding safeguarding, so we really appreciate that. My question is just around, I note your worrying point there about how schools are built and how lack of accessibility can impact our young people, and I note I was in St Colm's College, it's a secondary school in Derry, on Friday, and they had been promised funding for a wheelchair lift for their drama theatre, and that has sadly been pulled. So just to note the impact I know that will have on staff and students. So I 100% agree, when we talk about inclusion, it can't just be a buzzword, it has to be met with investment, and we have to support pupils and staff wherever possible. My question is just around looking at outside of school hours, so whether it's after school programmes, summer schemes, local council projects, what we've seen time and time again is that they really lack inclusion and accessibility. Things even like our public services and facilities like play parks, or lack of changing places. Is that an issue you're hearing a lot from parents? Where have we gone wrong, and how do you think we can get this right?
You seem to find the same problem popping up across different domains. So the same child that can't get into the school can't go to the playground.
Mm-hmm.
You hear this as well from disabled adults. They have to go to hospital. The hoist is broken. They're sitting in a continence product instead of being able to use the bathroom, and that's really, it creates great indignity for those people. And it's a society-wide issue that we all need to think about. There's not a good enough awareness of it. We can all do better at it. There's a proactive planning duty in relation to disability inclusion. So it's not just a matter of waiting, someone comes along in a wheelchair and you go, oh dear, we don't have a bathroom. We know people have wheelchairs and we know they're probably going to come along. So we need to plan ahead. And there could be maybe some work done around making those proactive duties more enforceable. They're a bit wishy-washy. The ones in Sendo, for example, aren't great. There's a bit of a planning duty and that's nice, but does it really happen? And what do you do if it doesn't? So maybe some work around that. Or even making sure that resources are available for proactive making spaces inclusive. You know, why was that lift not done now? What was the reason for that? And where's that money gone to instead? So it's prioritising resources towards disability equality. A lot of our schools aren't in a fit state. They're overcrowded. There's too many children in them. They've got steps and stairs and higgledy-piggledy arrangements that aren't good, and not good for autistic children or blind children or all sorts of children. So we need to be really starting to educate ourselves and staff about how to make environments accessible, and if we're building new environments to make sure they're fully accessible. The changing places issue, I haven't been actively involved in that myself, but I've definitely observed a growing trend of parents bringing that forward. You see a lot of it in social media, and I applaud them for that, because parents and people with experience are bringing these issues to us, and we can then look and see, well, what does the law say? Maybe the law is not good enough, maybe we need to change it, or maybe we need to create a policy around changing places. Why should that child not go to the playground like all of the other children, for example? They can only go to one playground. They can't just hop into that playground that they're driving past on the way to somewhere else. So it's just about thinking more about disabled people and their rights. And I think that's been my theme today, and it's a theme that's coming up in our work at the minute. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for your time. And just lastly, Chair, I note, Rachel, your point on school refusal and school refusers. Is there any chance we could meet with young people and have them in an informal meeting perhaps with the committee? Maybe it would be beneficial for us to hear directly from them and their lived experience and why they don't show up for class. Maybe that might be beneficial.
Yeah, there's a particular child I could think of that might be interested. You know, there may be children that we could, or there may be other you could put a call out. Can I just ask one thing? Can we stop? And this is not a criticism because it's common parlance. Let's stop calling these children school refusers. Yeah. They're not. It's not that they're refusing school. They are not enabled to go to school. They want to go to school. They really do. And it's such a struggle to get their uniform on, to get out of the house, into the car, sitting in the car looking at that door, shaking, trying to get up the steps and in the door. Then the bell rings and crowds start moving. And just to get out of the house, into the car, out of the car, into the hall, that's an outcome and an achievement and an impact and should be praised. Not, would you tuck your shirt in? And then their way home again. That it's not refusal, it's severe and chronic, terrible anxiety, crippling. So let's help these children to enable them.
I think that's really helpful, and thank you for raising that, Cara. I had a meeting recently with the psych team within the EA, and they were referring to, I think the phrase they use is EBSA. I don't know if that's an appropriate...
Yes, school avoidance. Again, I call it school-based anxiety.
School-based anxiety. So, I mean, it might be worth hearing from that team in terms of what is the response that we have at the moment to that. I don't think that response is anywhere near adequate, and they acknowledge that.
We've raised this with the Permanent Secretary as part of a delegation with CDSA, Children with Disabilities Strategic Alliance, because we were seeing so many children not attending school, and I don't think the solutions have been found to it yet.
There is a whole wider piece on attendance, but that anxiety-based aspect of it, and I think if we could hear from young people impacted, that's something we can take forward. So,
thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thanks, I'm conscious of time. I'm going to bring Danny in, and then David, and we're
thank you, Chair. Going later down the list, I have most of my questions were asked. You'd be glad to know. So it was just really then the reference an article yesterday in the Belfast Telegraph where you were quoted as well, and it was the disparities between the old, I'll have to read it out because I can't remember the criteria for assessing support. So it was like in the north and east, children require a statement to, for placement for speech and language class, but that requirement is not in place for south and west. And it's just, we're talking about cooperation, we're talking across departmental, Children's Services Corporation Act earlier on, and that's even happening.
Yeah, there's differences in provision. I suppose that's understandable in one sense, that we had 5 education and library boards and we've moved to 1 EA. It's been a while now, and you would think that maybe those would have stabilised. What I have tended to find is, unfortunately, if there are differences across services, they go to the lowest base, and you'll get the lowest level of service becomes the standard. So I'm a bit careful about saying, let's rationalise everything. Different local areas might have different needs. But I think the key point is that the intervention needs to be there when it's needed. And it goes back to Nicky's Too Little Too Late report, which I view as the baseline of where we started. And when they brought that forward, they consulted everybody, including us, and they took a lot of advice and evidence. And found that the services just weren't available without going through loads of bureaucratic hoops, such as having to go to a psychologist or having to get a statement. So that was way back when Nicky did that report. So it's again highlighting that same issue of why are there all these? It's like the Grand National trying to get to some help. Needs identified, appropriate pathways available, child gets help, we all move on, probably don't need a statement. It's as simple as that. And that's where all of the money and focus needs to go.
Thank you.
David?
Thanks very much, Chair. Chair, first, with your indulgence, just to make a point, and I clarify that my wife is a governor at a grammar school. I'm not going to bump heads with Pat because I think the overarching point that he was making is a valid one. But as someone who went to a grammar school and for a number of years had a part-time attendance because of health issues rather than disability, I think it's important, and you raised it, that to recognise that our grammar schools have nuances and people within them that are from not only have different challenges, but also they're from different backgrounds. I mean, I came from a working class background, and at Grosvenor I went to school with people who were from Ballybean, from the Lower Newtonards Road, and so on. It may be situated in a suburb, but the people who attended are not always, it's not always reflective. And equally, I know people who went to Inst and some of our prestigious grammar schools that were from very much working class backgrounds as well. I just think it's important to recognise that and balance that, and that there are challenges in every school for those things. Moving on then, just to say, you said about people recognising that they sometimes don't have the knowledge, and standing up and saying that. As a new person to this committee and to this area, a lot of this is something I'm learning, and it's a steep learning curve and trying to get to grips with. And I have to say, Aurelia's case studies is a powerful example in terms of getting us to think seriously about these things, and away from policy is important, but this is people. And I think that's, and as Robbie says, not only has she been listened to, but it's been very helpful, I think, to all members of this committee. I just wanted, a lot of the questions, as has been said, has been asked, but I would just ask, you said within your briefing that there's been despite your involvement in the reference group, there's been a lack of clarity from EA around what transformation is happening on the ground there. And just if you could touch on that and why you think that is it because they're trying to disguise a lack of movement? Is it just resistance to some things? Why do you think that is? Why the pushback?
Back on the leafy suburbs again, don't leave that just too soon. I will say as well as that grammar schools don't have a lot of children with special educational needs, so officially there will be children with a lot of needs, and that's something else that maybe needs to be looked at and rebalanced. I think the department will look at that. The vast majority of children with special educational needs go to non-grammar schools, so maybe the work could be shared out and the support could be shared out a bit more evenly, you could argue as well, but your point is very valid as well. And your question there really about the transparency of the EA processes, I'm sort of standing with my feet in two camps here, and I have been for some time. So Children's Law Centre is on the SEND Transformation Project Reference Group. That's very hard to say still, and we have been on that for a number of years, and it's a good group in many ways. There's a good project lead on it, and there's lots of sort of flow charts and diagrams and lots of big. I'm actually missing it this afternoon, thanks to you. There's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of processes. We do need processes, we do need timelines, and we do need that sort of analytical stuff, and I like that. But what I've been saying for some time is I am concerned about the Children's Law Centre's role in that, because we want to support change, and want to support the EA, we want to support the DE, and we do support positive change. But we're not certain that we can stand over what's being done, because we cannot see on the ground what's happening, despite having any number of documents, meetings, events, really good events, good collaborative events. Could I tell you what a statement an officer is doing in the EA when they're making a decision whether to grant a statutory assessment? No. Now, I did raise that. That's my area of expertise. I have a lot to offer there about where the threshold is legally. I haven't been allowed to get into that. What's happening with the local integrated teams? Do the local integrated teams know what's happening with the local integrated teams? Where are we with that? So what's going to happen to literacy support? What's going to happen to autism support? What about blind children, deaf children? What is it going to look like? How will they get in? How will they get out? I don't know. And I don't know if anyone knows. And I'm thinking to myself, that can't be right. I've spent a lot of hours at a lot of meetings about SEND transformation. And what I'm talking to you about today is really airing that frustration. I'm dealing with children and people, and I want to know what help they're going to get and when. And I want the pathways and systems to be in place, but not to be so process heavy as to be unusable. So I think it might just be that we're not at a stage yet where that nitty-gritty information has been formed, but these are supposed to be starting in September in some form, even in an early form. So I think it would be good for the committee to maybe ask questions around what do these look like, and how do children get referred to them, and who makes decisions about who gets what help, and when is that going to be operating, and what impact have you assessed it that it's going to have, and is it based on need? If we've got 2,000 children, have we enough help for 2,000 children? Have we apportioned it out amongst the right services for the need that's there, or have we just gone, well, quick, let's put a team together? I'm not sure which of those two things it is, and I should know that, being on those groups.
Thank you. That has been a really helpful session, and I hope that it will inform our questions for our next set of witnesses coming through. And I assume there's going to be a big focus on SEN in that session. So Rachel, thank you, and just echo comments made from other members. Thank you for all the work that you do in this space. It really is. It's absolutely vital that the child's rights focus on whenever we come to SEN is not lost. So thank you.
Thank you for all your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we'll take a short comfort break in a minute, but just to agree some actions arising for that, and there were a few. So just to check, committees agreed, as proposed by Robbie, that we write maybe through the Children's Law Centre, in terms of we do reach out to make contact with Aurelia to thank her for sharing her story, and potentially to offer a visit to Parliament buildings. Clark can take that forward. There was some discussion around restraint and seclusion. We wanted to check, would members be happy that we haven't really factored that into forward work plan, and that we do write to the Minister perhaps for an update on where that sits, and just to maybe raise a concern that the committee is keen to see that guidance is delivered in genuine partnership with health, and maybe to get a bit of an update on that. There was a lot of discussion around school attendance, and I think it's just, again, if we're agreed to factor into forward work planning some sort of engagement around with the EA, and potentially with children and young people impacted by some of these issues around barriers to attending school that might be related to mental health or additional needs. We all agreed on those actions. Is there anything I've missed arising from that?
Actually, maybe we could write to St Genevieve's as well. I think as a committee it would be nice for us to recognise best practice and where schools are really delivering, and just say we were really impressed with Aurelia and what the Children's Law Centre had to say about them and how welcoming they were.
Members agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. Members, there were also, this may be for your strategic planning, but there were also references to the Department of Communities Disability Strategy, the role of the Department of Health in restraint and seclusion guidance, and having uniformity across the board for both education and health in that respect, and then the role of the Department of Finance in the Children's Services Coordination implementation. So those are things that I will put on our strategic planning day so that we can look at how we might address those, whether we can do some work together with other committees.
Thank you for that. No, definitely missed in my scribbled notes here,
No,
so
no,
thank
no.
you. No, that's great. Much
Yes,
appreciated.
there was such a
No,
lot
that's
today.
great.
Great.
Okay, so I think there was maybe some interest in getting a photo.
Yes, for
but
International Women's
maybe
Day.
if we do that,
We've
and
all-
then
we're rocking
I'm
their
not sure
colours.
we've all followed the directive in terms of our attire.
true.
But,
One is green.
But if we could maybe
We're green.
go into
Green
just to try and get the
and
live feed turned off, and we'll get a photo, and then take a short comfort break before our next one.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
A bit of a delay here, sorry.
It's okay.
That's us now.
Okay. Do you want to bring the witnesses through? Yes, please. Okay, so while we're just bringing the witnesses in, I would refer members to the briefing paper from the committee clerk at page 20 of your papers, and then the departmental the briefing papers provided by the department as well, pages 21 to 48 of the meeting packet. Yeah, and there was some additional material in the tabled papers as well. Okay, so I'll just let everybody get settled and then we can introduce. Okay, so we're moving on. This is item 6 in the agenda, and this is a briefing from the Department of Education, and it's the on education policy and children's services area of the department's work. So you're all very welcome here today. So thank you for making yourselves available to the committee. I'm going to introduce each of you, but you all take the opportunity to introduce yourselves and your roles when we hand over to you. So we're pleased to welcome Lindsay Farrell, Deputy Secretary in the Department of Education, Janice Scallon, Director of Inclusion in the department, and Karen McCulloch, Director of Qualifications 14 to 19 Strategy, Youth Work Policy, but you can all describe your roles in a bit more detail. So we have had a really, really good session today already, and I think a lot of the issues we've covered will cover your area of work today. But we are probably quite pressed for time, so we want to make sure that we make the most of this session. So I'm going to ask, and I would emphasise for a presentation of up to 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes in terms of what you would like to brief the committee on, and then we will move into a question and answer session from there. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for the opening comments and for the opportunity to be here today to brief the committee on a range of priority issues across my portfolio in the Education Policy and Children's Services group within the department. So that group consists of 4 directorates covering curriculum assessment, teacher education and professional learning, qualifications 14 to 19 and youth work policy, inclusion, raising aspirations, supporting learning and empowering improvement. For the purposes of today's briefing, I propose to focus on a number of key priorities in line with the department's corporate plan of ensuring that all our children are happy, learning and succeeding. The focus of the department is quite deliberately on the child and refocusing around the foundational elements of what makes a high quality education system. So effective teaching and learning, an assessment system that measures progression and developing a pathway to inclusion where the needs of all our children and young people are met. To achieve this, the department is committed to taking forward a programme of transformational and progressive change across a range of policy areas, recognising that our world is an ever-changing one and the needs of our children are changing too within that. The last number of years have presented unprecedented challenges for education here. The pandemic brought its own unique circumstances, and its legacy continues to impact greatly on many of our children and young people, and particularly the most vulnerable. The profile of our children is changing, and you will have heard that already today, with increasing numbers of children presenting with special educational needs, growing issues with emotional health and well-being, and changing trends in terms of school attendance. In response, the department is progressing 2 transformational end-to-end reviews, one on special educational needs and one focusing on school improvement. In relation to special educational needs, I referred to our vision for all our children is that they will be happy, they will be learning and they will be succeeding. This is no different for our children with special educational needs. The end-to-end review is focused on improving outcomes for our children and young people with special educational needs through the provision of high-quality, cost-effective SEND provision. In practice, this means that children should have their needs identified earlier, receive timely and appropriate provision in response to those needs, and have their voices heard and those of their parents or carers. The end-to-end review is examining the entire process of identifying, assessing and meeting the needs of children with special educational needs, through from our policy intention right through to direct service provision for children. There are 12 work streams within this review covering a range of issues, from the statementing process, the delivery model of pupil support, building effective early intervention approaches and supporting effective transitions for young people leaving school. Our ultimate vision for children with SEN is a system where their needs are met with the right support, by the right people, at the right time and, importantly, in the right place. We are working to identify early actions that can make improvements for children with SEN who are currently in our system. However, in parallel, we are developing our understanding of inclusive practice and how our education system needs to evolve to meet our changing pupil population. Our work in school improvement seeks to review current policy and consider how it is operationalised on the ground within schools. At the heart of the review is how we drive up standards for all our children and create the right conditions for high quality teaching and learning. The review is looking at issues such as the use of school development planning, the operational support available to schools on a daily basis, processes for following up on school inspections, and curriculum development and professional learning for teachers and our non-teaching staff. A significant aspect of the review will also concentrate on those children who experience barriers to their learning as a result of their disadvantage, having experienced trauma or having arrived as newcomers to our system. Teaching and learning are fundamental to any effective education system, and this means focusing on what is being taught, how it is being taught, and ensuring the needs of the learner are balanced within the learning experience. The curriculum is the engine room within every school, and indeed for our society and our economy, and we must ensure that our curriculum remains relevant and can respond with greater agility to the changing needs of economy and our society. With this in mind, we have prioritised a number of curriculum areas of focus, including digital skills, modern languages, and green growth and climate change. In addition, we continue to respond to a range of evaluations on important areas of the curriculum, such as RSE and PE. Our teachers do remain our most valuable resource, and we cannot and must not take this for granted. Through the end-to-end review, we're working to support effective implementation of the Learning Leaders strategy by developing a framework for teacher professional learning that both supports and equips our teachers for the classrooms of today. We must also ensure that qualifications are fit for a modern economy and society, that they are current and continue to meet the needs of young people and employers. Many jurisdictions are on a journey of educational reform, and we are in the early stages of that process. We are working with our partners in SEA to ensure we keep pace with best practice internationally and to help inform the Department's policy response. Through the 14 to 19 Framework and Action Plan, we are continuing to work with our colleagues in the Department for the Economy around the development of approaches to careers advice and education, and a range of other actions focused on improving pathways for young people. We recognise that many of our young people enjoy the benefits of the high quality youth provision offered across many communities. In light of that, we have initiated a review of the existing priorities for youth policy and are engaging directly with young people to ensure that their lived experiences are at the heart of this process. The Department also continues to take forward implementation of the A Fair Start programme in response to the recommendations made by the panel in 2021. I hope the committee has found this high-level summary useful, and we're very happy to now take questions on any of the areas mentioned or on broader areas of interest. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and look, I appreciate there's an awful lot of work goes on in this department and more. So, we're never going to cover it in the session today. Thank you for attending, and thank you for the summary. I would think there's been a big focus in our discussions today already in relation to special educational needs, and like that'll come as any surprise to you. So I just want to focus on that, and I'll make a very brief comment and then get to the main question. I would want to just say, first of all, that we do welcome the end-to-end review. I think there's a general commitment within the committee to support where it's appropriate to support that work, but we also want to make sure that appropriate scrutiny is brought to bear on it. And there was a lot of material that we've heard from our evidence sessions today, which I think will raise a lot of further questions from committee members. But certainly the need for transformation in the system, we all acknowledge and want to be able to support the department where possible with that. And I think there will be questions around how that is delivered, but my question really comes on the back of engagement with constituents. It comes on the back of an engagement we had with Send Reform NI this week in an informal session with the committee, and I just want to get that out now, that my question is not about the bigger picture, it is about the here and now. What I'm hearing from parents is genuine fear, genuine anxiety as they look to September. They are extremely concerned, particularly when we're looking at preschool, entrance into primary and into post-primary, that we're going to see similar scenarios as we did in the last academic year, with children with special educational needs still unplaced in August, still unplaced for some of them at Christmas, some of them still perhaps in a placement in the new year, but that placement not actually being fully accessible to them, so not actually able to engage in the full aspect of that place, maybe some home learning being provided. None of that is acceptable, and some of the descriptions from those parents as to how that process impacted the child, crucially, but the wider family, I think are heartbreaking, and we think we would all be agreed we don't want to see that repeated. So I'm really asking today, can we get an update on where this is at in terms of the placement, so in terms of the numbers of additional places that are required, what work is going on to deliver on it, and what can the department give today in terms of an assurance to those parents who are expressing genuine dread as to what's ahead, that those mistakes will not be repeated. And I appreciate some of this is operational and sits with the EA, but ultimately we have the departmental officials who own the whole process before us today, so we would really welcome as a committee clarity on those points.
Absolutely, Chair, and I'm happy to make some high-level comments in response, and Janice can come in around the detail in terms of the SEND placements. We know, and our ministers made very clear, that special educational needs is of utmost priority to the department. These are some of our most vulnerable children, and I agree that it isn't acceptable for them to be treated differently. There are many reasons as to why the process is taken forward differently in terms of admissions. Every statement is, I suppose, individually negotiated, both with schools and with parents. So there are all of those reasons underpinning the process as to why sometimes things can take a bit longer. But there are many general issues that we do need to get to the heart of. Those are around better planning and ensuring that we're drawing on both the data that we have, but also identifying the data both that we could find or that would be useful from our partners in the Department of Health, for example, that would help support better planning, both in the immediate, but also to get ahead of this issue in the longer term. We do lead a group, I chair a group on a monthly basis with the Education Authority. Janice meets with them on a weekly basis around placements, because we do accept that the urgency of the issues around this. We too have heard many of those testimonies that you speak of from both parents and from children, and we are very mindful of the impact that this has, which is why we have taken the initiative to lead this group. It's looking at the data requirements. It's looking at the capital and the estate requirements. It's looking at the support requirements that are required to support schools with the establishment of additional specialist provisions. And it's also looking at the advice and the communication to parents and how we engage better with them around the process. You are right, responsibility for the placement of children does sit with the EA, but that is absolutely not something that we can absolve ourselves from the responsibility of, which is why we are taking such an active interest at this time. But maybe Janice, you want to come in around some of the specifics of the details.
Yeah, so we know already that there's been a significant increase in the number of children with special educational needs and those who have a statement of special educational needs. So from a process point of view, the transition years from P7 to Year 8, data are in on those and have been in for some time, because each of those children require an annual review of their statement, and that's an individual process with the child, the family and all of the adults who work around that child. That then comes into the Education Authority and the planning process begins in terms of where is the best place for that child, securing that appropriate placement, be it in a special school or specialist provision or in a mainstream class. The consultation that takes place between the EA and an individual school. So if you just bear with me a second. So for each statement, the Education Authority determines the placement that's appropriate. Educational psychologists determine that. The parent then agrees with the placement or not, as the case may be, and expresses their preference for the school. The EA then goes to that school and consults with the school. The school can say yes or no. The school says yes, the placement is secured. If the school says no, that comes back and has to go through the same process over again. So there is a need to look at that process and streamline that process. From the department's point of view, we definitely need to look at that. In the early years then, the nursery children coming through into P1, same process. But as Lindsay has said, we do need to take a look at the data coming through for the children that we don't know yet, that are coming into our system for the first time, and that's about engaging with our health colleagues. The latest information that I have from the Education Authority is that over 1,000 additional places across specialist provision, across mainstream classes and in special schools will be required for September 24. As Lindsay said, I meet with my counterparts in the Education Authority every week to get an update on these figures and the planning. So they have written out to all schools. There are specific geographical areas of pressure, and individual schools in those areas have been contacted again by telephone. Slowly but surely, schools are starting to come on board to see how they can help create that additional space and place within their school.
Appreciate the update. It's clearly a huge challenge. We have over 1,000 places. Those are staggering numbers, and I appreciate that the mantra, which I think is a great mantra, the right support from the right people, right time, right place, those things are absolutely where we should be aspiring to. But in terms of delivering that aspiration for those children in September, how far off are we from delivering that?
Do you want me to cover that, Lindsay? So as I said, P70 Year 8 is able to be prioritised because the annual review can take place, and the EA are now in the process of mapping as those annual reviews come through from P1 children, from nursery children moving into P1, and then they'll move to map. That should be done by mid-March, I think. Please don't quote me on that. I think it's mid-March. They've said to me that they should have that mapping process done, and that's when they'll go out. Counter to that, I think our primary school mainstream non-statemented, non-special educational needs population is going down. So as Lindsay referenced earlier, the profile of our children is changing. We have the same number of children across the board every year in education, but more and more children are presenting with a multiplicity of needs, especially in those early years. So P70 Year 8 cohort seems to be pretty much actually there at the moment, but it's those early years now that we need to focus on to make sure the provision's available.
I wanted to labour the point because I know other members want to come in, but if you wanted...
If I could just add to that in terms of work that we were able to initiate through the Fair Start programme in response to some of the emerging pressures in the early years, and I think this is probably an issue has been brought to the committee's attention, is exploring further the additional role that the voluntary and community sector could play in terms of supporting the system around this. We have been funding through a Fair Start a pilot involving Solus and Sure Start, a Belfast-wide pilot, and that has very much been looking at how Sure Starts in the voluntary and community sector could actually provide for these children who are emerging in the early years with particular special educational needs. We don't have a final evaluation of that because we're hoping that that will run until June, budget dependent, at which point we'll have a final evaluation. But certainly the emerging findings from that are very positive in terms of both the impacts on the children and young people, which is what we're most interested in, but also in terms of the positive relationships between voluntary and community sector, education provision and the allied health professionals involved in that project. So again, I think that's something we need to learn from and help inform. I take your point, Chair. There's very much a longer term direction of travel around special educational needs, and transformation will take time. but the most urgent aspect of that is placements for children. It's the most visible outworking. It's the thing that is going to build confidence with parents, with schools and with children that things are changing. And so we do very much appreciate the urgency around that placements issue, whilst also needing that eye to the longer term transformation of our SEND system, as Janice has pointed to.
Look, I think you can be assured the committee will want to have a big focus on the longer term piece, but short term is critical, and I think trust and confidence in the EA and the department is probably at an all-time low among parents with children with special educational needs, and we can't have another crisis in this September, I think, because if we're going to have credibility with the transformation piece, we need to be getting the here and now right as well. But I'll leave it at that. Deputy Chair.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming. I suppose we heard from the Children's Law Centre there just before you came in, and Rachel talked about one case in particular, a young woman by the name of Aurelia, who suffers from cerebral palsy, is in a wheelchair and has certain needs that need to be met. And she had great difficulty getting into a school of her choice and lost months of her education as a result of that. And you talked earlier on there, Lindsay, about high quality, cost effective provision, and Aurelia didn't get that. Now, I suppose we can talk about end-to-end reviews, we can, talk about happy learning, succeeding, and all of that. But really, what families want to know is, if there's a process for my child who has special needs, what does that look like? So, explain to the committee how a child is going to be identified as having special needs, when they're going to be identified with having special needs, and what processes and procedures are going to be put in place to ensure that that child's needs are met, and met in a timely fashion.
Well, thank you, Pat, and we can talk about what the process is now. The end-to-end review is supposed to be about designing solutions and for how that process should work much better. And that is why we have a work stream around early identification of need, early intervention, because what we want is a system that isn't necessarily reliant on the child having to wait months for a diagnosis before support can then be provided, during which time the needs of that child become more complex and actually more costly to respond to. We want to have a system where at the earliest point in a child's life, and ideally where health and education are sharing information with each other about emerging need. Some of these children are known about from the day they are born. But that information isn't effectively passing between two systems, and we know all the complexities that can make that difficult. But that's what we need to crack, so that at the point when a child is born with a condition or something where it's going to be known that they're going to have special educational needs, that information can pass to the education system and we can be planning. We accept, Pat, and the range of scrutiny reports in relation to special educational needs have flagged that early identification of need isn't necessarily working, or where it is being identified, those needs are not being met early enough. And so our focus needs to be on upfronting investment in that early response to a child's need.
Could I just stop you at that point, Lindsay? Because the transformation programme funding has been cut by 50%. Funding for SENCOs in schools has been cut by 50%. So how does that tie in with what you're saying? It doesn't seem to make any sense that if you're talking about early identification, that's where you need to focus and target your funding to ensure that the system is picking out those kids who need help and support.
Okay, in terms of I think you're referring to the EA-led SEND transformation programme, the budget of which was cut by 20 or 50% due to the budgetary pressures last year. That was not directly impacting on children and young people with special educational needs. The block grant for special educational needs remained unchanged last year. within the EA. That was a specific ring-fence programme within the Education Authority through which they were taking forward a number of transformation projects relating to special educational needs. The funding was cut on that, but ultimately impacted on teams within the Education Authority, and the work of many of those transformation projects were actually subsumed within our end-to-end review that's being led within the department. In terms of the reduction...
Well, just you mentioned teams.
Yes.
You know, there was supposed to be a plan there for multidisciplinary teams, and that has now been changed to area integrated teams or something like that, which seems to be a different concept altogether. So, I mean, and I suppose the point I want to drill down into here is, you know, we all understand, and the evidence is there from many sources, that we get funding at early years has much more impact than later on. But if budgets are being cut, then how do we expect any sort of delivery? And just to flag this up with you too, you know, the audit report of a number of years ago told us that in spite of hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on special educational needs, the Education Authority and the department couldn't show that there was value for money there with that. So I suppose the question is, what has changed? I know there are a couple of questions in there, but
no, and I might need you to remind me about all aspects of the question, but just that latter point, I take you back to the purpose of the end-to-end review, which is precisely what you've just said, Pat. It's about the provision of high quality, cost-effective services. And let me be very clear, this is not about reducing budgets for special educational needs or reducing budgets that will make these children's lives better. This is about improving the cost effectiveness of what is a significant amount of resource going into special educational needs. And the purpose of the end-to-end review is to get in under the skin of all of that and identify opportunities across that to actually invest that money differently. The parameters within which we're taking forward that end-to-end review are quite complex because we're working within a statutory framework whereby children must be assessed, must receive a statement within 26 weeks, and so a lot of the work is focused around meeting those legislative targets, and those are very important statutory protections for parents in the process. But we need to find a way of unlocking resource within the system and putting it to those areas that are going to deliver greatest impact. Back to your point about the transformation programme, that programme had been underway for a number of years and wasn't actually making the impact that we would have wanted to have seen, or indeed that the system would have wanted to have seen. The Ipsos Mori report was very clear that there was huge frustration in the system at the perceived lack of progress with the transformation programme and at the pace of the change that was required. And so that was why the decision was taken to actually reduce that funding around the transformation programme, but ensure that those important issues are still being picked up through the end-to-end review. And just to be very clear, EA are continuing to lead a number of transformation projects under the auspices of the end-to-end review, one of which is around the establishment of those local integrated teams that you've talked about. So the evidence does point to the need for a multidisciplinary approach to meeting the needs of children. So the EA have been working up models for what that would look like in terms of reconfiguring their pupil support services so that they would be organised on a locality basis, on a multidisciplinary approach, and we're working with them as they bring forward plans on the implementation of what those local integrated teams would look like. Ultimately, those also would be enhanced if there was health input, but those are discussions that we need to have with health in the longer term.
Just final one, short one, just to follow up on this. I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is there a difference between what was originally conceived as the multidisciplinary team and these local integrated teams?
No.
You're saying there's no difference?
It's not my understanding that there's a difference. I think the name was changed purely to make it clearer what they were. It was about to give the sense that it was on that locality basis and that they would be integrated teams in terms of having input from the range of pupil support services that are already existing within the EA. And the intention behind them is that they'll provide that more holistic approach to meeting children's needs, because the criticism around the current service delivery model, Pat, has been that each service operates in quite a siloed way, each with its own set of criteria that need to be met. So if you have a child that's actually, and often the profile of these children is that they have a complexity of need and they will require support from a number of those services. As currently configured, that doesn't work. And so the intention behind these local integrated teams is that the child can be wrapped around in that more holistic way. There'll be a single point of entry for schools, so the process will become a lot more streamlined. So that is no different. I think it's just the language has changed around the name of those teams.
If I could just pick up on that. So just to be clear, there was never an intention that health would be involved in those teams, and that has shifted, because I mean our understanding is that for this to work, that health needs to be involved, and it seems to me that this feels diluted.
No, absolutely not. The intention is for health to be a part of that model, but I think it will be a stepped process and a phased process. So where EA can reconfigure their services, that can obviously happen more quickly than having that health input. So I think that would almost be phase 2 of establishing those local integrated teams. But we are starting those discussions with health around what all of our models look like, because we're very conscious EA are taking forward work around local integrated teams. Separately, health are considering a multidisciplinary approach within their trust areas. So we do need to bring together the thinking around that, but that will all need to be explored in a lot more detail with health. But ultimately, that would be our aim, yes.
David?
I have another question, but just to say on that, I am slightly worried those discussions haven't yet taken place, and whilst not having the understanding that yourselves may have the intricacies of this, it seems to me that planning is best done at the earliest possible stage, and health are having these discussions, you say, around primary care and how to roll that out across the country in that way. It makes sense while they're looking at that, and it doesn't make sense to me to wait until you've got your end sorted and they've got their end sorted, but those discussions should be probably happen at an earlier stage. I'll let you come in that.
No, absolutely. I'm sorry if I've given the impression they're not happening. They are happening. They're
Yes.
at an early stage. I just don't think they're at the stage where I could say to you, health will be involved in local integrated teams by September. But just to give the committee assurance just around the health education interface, because we know this is a key criticism of how the system currently works. We have established our strategic oversight group over the end-to-end review of special educational needs, which has senior representation from the Department of Health now involved. Underneath that, I jointly chair, along with the EAR programme board, around the end-to-end review, and again has senior input from the Department of Health on that. And we have established a joint DE health oversight group that had been stood up during COVID, and we're now stepping up again, really in line with some of the issues around special educational needs, and that will be something that Janice will chair along with her counterpart in health, because you're absolutely right. We need to get to a place where we're effectively jointly planning and jointly commissioning around children with special educational needs.
Oh, absolutely. Just then to move on to another point, I visited recently Greenwood Assessment Centre in my own constituency, who do wonderful work in facilities that are just not fit for purpose. And that was a discussion for last week, I'm not going to go down that route, but one of the things they said that really would help them, and they felt the wider sector in that regard, was, and my colleague Cheryl Brownlee here touched on it earlier on in part of the discussions, but I raised it last week and they said it was best for this week, was the mainstreaming of a significant element of SEN training for all teachers as they go through their training process, because they're finding it quite difficult to recruit staff whenever they need them, and quite often they feel that it's not because there's a shortage of teachers per se, but because a lot of teachers feel intimidated and not suited to that environment, and it's because they haven't had that training, but also maybe even a placement in one of those settings as a mandatory part of their training, so that they have seen and know how that's an option for them, because through that experience they may decide that that's a route they want to go down, and if it's not where they want to go down, if they're if they're without a permanent post and looking for options, and that comes up, they'll not be intimidated to go in and support the work of that school then. So is there work ongoing on that?
Thank you, David. And we would totally agree with that assessment. Teacher professional learning is a key theme in the end-to-end review. It's come out strongly, both in terms of our engagement across the system, but also in terms of a recent ETI evaluation of teacher professional learning, particularly to special educational needs. This would be an issue that our special school principals would raise regularly. Actually, at our Moving Forward Together event, which was held some weeks ago around special educational needs, Professor Noel Purdy spoke from Stranmillis, and he used a quote which has stuck with me, that every teacher is a teacher of special educational needs. And that's absolutely a theme for us, and at one of the specific work streams. So we've set up a strategic engagement group with the HEIs involved in our initial teacher education, and are having very specific discussions with them around special educational needs. What is the most appropriate direction of travel in terms of ensuring there's the right level built into initial teacher education? Is there the need for some sort of additional specialism, for example? But we know that initial teacher education is just one part of the jigsaw, and actually much more is required around continuous teacher professional learning. I'm not sure, Janice, if there's more you want to say around that.
I mean, we're already seeing really good practice voluntarily on the ground. I was up with a special school very recently who have reached out to all of their local mainstream schools who had specialist provision and are sharing the learning. So it is happening in pockets. There's pockets of really, really good practice, and some of the adults working in our special schools have amazing levels of knowledge and years of experience. So there's something there around getting that expertise out to the wider system as well. So as Lindsay's already said, from end to end, from initial teacher education, teaching practice as part of that initial teacher education, right through to the continuous professional development of our teachers in schools, but also utilising the existing expertise that sits out there already in our special schools and our support staff as well, to be fair to say.
Clearly there's our specialism we give opportunity to recognise that level of knowledge, but that base level that all teachers should have, I think, is important as well. Thank you very much.
And it's important to say, we also have a funding relationship with the Middletown Centre of Autism, for example, and the feedback around their support for schools is exemplary. They do a lot of work, not just on a one-to-one basis with children, but in building that whole school approach to autism. That's their area of specialism, but there's certainly a model there, and certainly we're looking at all of these models. But this will require additional investment to support our teaching workforce. And just to provide further assurance to the committee, this is something that we're very keen is seen as an integral part of teacher professional learning in its own right. So it's not seen as just the bailiwick of SEN, but actually it needs to be considered as we're implementing our learning leader strategy across the system, that special educational needs is a core component of that.
I agree for the need for investment, and I hope the criticism around some of the cuts that would have concerned us all is reflected in representations to the Finance Minister to give the necessary resource in that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got Danny next, and we are getting very tight for time, so if I can just ask, I mean, there's a lot to cover, but to keep questions and answers as succinct as possible.
Thank you, Chair, and you have to bear with me a wee tiny bit, so thank you for coming today and your time and answers so far. I suppose for me, I try to be positive, but I have a real fear going forward. There has been multitude of reports, there's shelves filled with strategies and policies, and still on the ground the failures there. There's just too many families going through a hard time right now who can't get assessments, whether it's through health, or they can't get their statement, or they aren't getting the support in school, or children are getting put into mainstream schools and then end up through no fault of their own on reduced timetables, and that's still happening right now. And you know, going forward into the interview, I think we're at breaking point already of probably a broken system. If we don't get it right this time, that's it, and that's my fear, and I hope it works. But as I said, there's a lot of questions in and around that. They're like, where it all going to fit in with health. And you mentioned the community and voluntary sector. They have been amazing, and they always are, no matter what sector it's in. But a lot then gets put on them, it gets dropped on them, and then they don't get the support. So that always worries me around the community and voluntary sector, because they're not properly funded either. I have a couple of questions just around, like, is the department planning to publish an inclusive policy around children with special educational needs in education? Just, is there a plan for it? Is it, Lindsay?
So, I you know who I am by now anyway, Janice Scollins, so I'm Director for Inclusion in the department, and I have 3 teams, one of which is a special education and inclusion policy team.
Mm-hmm.
So we've embarked on a piece of work with the European Agency and the Strategic Investment Board to develop a roadmap towards inclusion. That's about to kick off in the next week or two, and there'll be a series of workshops and engagement around lots of different countries. The 33 countries involved in the European Agency are all at different stages on their journey to inclusion. Some have completed that journey and have a fully inclusive education system. Others are just starting on the journey. We have an excellent opportunity here to learn from practice in other countries what works, what doesn't work, but also to define what does inclusion mean. It's not just special educational needs. It's everyone's job. It's about children who are newly here in Northern Ireland, whether it's asylum seekers and refugee children, newcomer children, children who don't have English as a first language, and children looked after, and there's so many facets to inclusion. So we do need to do that roadmap towards inclusion to work out what does good look like.
Okay.
If we had inclusive schools, what would that look like?
We're really early stages then.
We're in the really early stages.
Okay.
Yes.
So just something you said earlier on that particularly jumped out at me. So just around the particular pressures geographically. Can you elaborate on that? What particular areas are facing that pressure?
I have a list I'm going to try and remember from the top of my head. So I know that we have Mid-Ulster, Newry, Morning Down, the Greater Belfast area, North Down and Ards. And I think there is one other, could be Mid and East Antrim, are the areas of particular pressure. And what that pressure amounts to is that either the special schools in those areas are completely over capacity and do not have the capacity to take any additional children, or there are mainstream schools in that area that don't have specialist provisions in any shape or form to take children who ordinarily, as I said earlier, would be in a mainstream class, but actually could benefit from that specialist provision, which is a smaller environment, a calmer environment that allows them regularity of sensory movement and fundamental movement breaks, and takes the noise that could affect their executive functioning that they would find in a busy mainstream class. That's where specialist provisions have been really beneficial for those children. It has removed that sensory overload and allows them to be open to learning because they're more regulated for longer. That allows their teaching and learn. So there's a combination of both overcapacitated special schools and a lack of specialist provision in the area. So the EA have contacted all schools individually in those areas.
Is the department using all current capacity available to it?
Yes. I mean, that's something that we're looking at right across the system. A lot of our mainstream schools have a lot of available places, and it's about making sure though that that's the right place for a child. It's not just about putting children in because there happens to be an available place. It's about making sure that the provision is set up correctly for those children.
So that's one element of the deal.
Last question.
One last one then, and then again, it just leads me into then just supernumerary then. What's your plans for supernumerary?
So at the minute, you'll all be aware that children, so 63% of children with special educational needs don't have a statement, don't require a statement of special educational needs. Their needs can be met either through the EA Pupil Support Services, the likes of Middletown Centre for Autism, and the school themselves. 37% of our children, around 7,000 children, have a statement of special educational needs, and they are supernumerary to a school's approved enrolment number at present. So this has been was raised in the Ipsos review as something that needed to be looked at, and it's also been raised in the Independent Review of Education. So that is under consideration at the minute in the department. It was something that I need to put my previous hat on. I was Director of Sustainable Schools, so it was looked at when I was over general school admissions. We consulted on the process around 2019, and our schools were not in that place at that time where they felt that to have to remove that supernumerary status, they weren't in the space of doing that at that time. The mood has changed now, and I think that schools understand more about what it means when they have a school could have an intake of 1,000 children, an enrolment of 1,000 children. Could have 200 children with statements, but those children aren't actually counted in their enrolment. So I think by simply understanding that better, the mood out there is different now. The proportion of children in our system that have special educational needs is bigger now than it ever was before. So now is the time to really consider that properly around supernumerary and
because that would be, that's me finishing off, is that fear where it began with when I was starting was about, we did hear a couple of weeks ago that children with special educational needs in mainstream setting are not getting the same as children in specialist schools. So that's a fear that was growing, that was raised here by the unions, that was 2 weeks ago. So
yes, and we have had engagement with the unions around some of those concerns in terms of the specialist provisions in mainstreams. Those concerns you will have heard, they've been around a sense that the placements aren't always appropriate, but also a sense that there was a lack of confidence across the system that they would receive the support that they needed in terms of setting up the SPIMs. And this is back to the need for us to be very clear on the model. There is evidence out there that says smaller group settings for children with special educational needs produces positive outcomes for them. But we also need to be clear that there's certain conditions that need to be met for those specialist provisions to be the most appropriate for children. That is that there's the appropriate physical environment, there's the appropriate staff resource who are adequately skilled and trained to meet the needs of children. And that we feel is feeding into the system. This lack of confidence then is underpinning some schools perhaps not being willing to come forward with those specialist provisions. And that is where the EA, with our support, need to be giving those assurances to the system around the model and around the support that will be in place if you establish a specialist provision. Because the counter to that are the many schools that we have been to that have spoken about the positive experience it has been, not just for the children in the specialist provision, but to the entire school. And where they're implemented and implemented well, it's true inclusion in practice, but we need to make that system-wide, and that requires the level of confidence in the system, and it requires the resource to be able to resource them to the way that they need to be able to meet those children's needs.
Thank you.
Okay, bringing Cheryl in next. Everybody who has not yet come in, everyone's still in. I've got indications from everybody, so we are going to really have to keep this super focused from here on in. Cheryl.
Okay, I'll try really hard. In terms of the Education Authority, and if you can comment on this, I noticed that there's 5 interim senior managers at the moment, and obviously the chief executive, I think, as well, will be going out for recruitment. So how is that impacting on everything, not having a steady ship as such? In terms of assessments, I understand one of the aspects is video recording, so a parent or carer will be requested to record their child in certain settings, and then that will be used as part of the process. I assume that's probably been from COVID times. Is that something that will continue, or will that be reviewed, and has it been successful? I was also concerned to hear during the week as well that statements, once a statement is issued in terms of an internal review, basically some of these are picked from a filing cabinet at random, maybe if they have time. Is that, that would cause me great concern if that's the way things are being checked internally? Is that the case? And moving forward, what way would statements be checked from within the Education Authority and Department?
Well, maybe have to draw a line.
Sorry,
on,
yes,
that's
right,
3
okay,
questions
fine.
we've got now.
Chance
so,
for the arm
yeah.
there.
Okay, I'll try and pick those up in turn. Some of them are straying into the operational
Yeah,
territory,
no.
and I may not be able to comment
Yep.
in great detail. But in terms of your point around the senior management structure within the Education Authority, I think that's a matter for the EA board to consider. I think some of the challenges specifically around special educational needs have been, in terms of the EA delivery, are a matter of public commentary. They've been laid out in those range of scrutiny reports that we've talked about. But nevertheless, the EA continues to be our key delivery partner around special educational needs. And therefore, it's really important that we're working collaboratively with them and hand in glove, ultimately for the good of children and young people. In terms of the video recording point, that is an operational matter. It's not one we are aware of, but we can certainly follow that up with the Education Authority. I presume it's in terms of educational psychology assessments.
Yeah, it's part of the assessment.
So we can follow up on that and come back to you with clarification. The internal review process is something that's being, that annual review process, I presume you're referring to, is something that's being picked up as we're looking at the statementing process from end to end, because we have received feedback about just how agile a process that is and how responsive it is to changing needs. So all I can say at this point is those issues are being considered through that work stream in terms of understanding how that works, who it is that's actually taking the decisions on fit of those annual reviews, and then what is done in response to that.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Kathy?
Thanks, Chair. My first question I hadn't really intended to ask, but it just comes off the back of what David and Danny were both discussing. I'd just like to know how the department can stand over that there are staff today currently in these specialist provisions in mainstream schools who are not getting the team teach training, the basic training that is needed, that the special school that's just up the road is receiving. And I take on your point that there's great expertise in these special schools. And in fact, one particular school that I'm talking about was told they weren't entitled to the team teach training, even though they're looking after the exact same children with the exact same needs. And they were told to go up the road to the special school and ask them for training. Rightly so, that special school said, we can't, we do not have the capacity, we do not have the time, we are stretched as it is. You know, do you agree that that fundamentally is wrong and needs to be changed? That's my first question. The second one, and it'll be much briefer, sorry, Chair, is the communication with parents. I don't need to rehearse the chaos that there was last year. One of the things in my office was inundated with was parents at their wits' end, because the communication between the Education Authority and them was just non-existent. It took us to intervene in most cases. What is being done there? Has there been engagement with the EA around that to make sure we're not facing into that this year? I know that the places are a separate issue, but that actual communication piece. And then finally, we're talking here, it's been mentioned a couple of times, around early intervention. I'd just like to know what work has been done internally across departments in terms, I know Paul Brush looks after the childcare aspect. Surely that is a place in the early years where there can be early intervention. And has there been work conducted there and work done there in terms of the childcare strategy? Thanks.
I'll try and pick up on those. In terms of the Team Teach one, that is one that has been raised with us from those involved in specialist provisions. That's one we will pick up separately with the Education Authority in terms of their training offering, because it would be my view certainly that needs to be consistent. And if we're saying that there's children in those specialist provisions in mainstream that that really it's the equal accesses to a special school that we need to ensure that training, so we can pick that up. In terms of the advice and communication with parents, that is one of the lines of that strategic placements group that I chair on the monthly basis, that Janice meets with them weekly around. Advice and communication to parents is one of the key themes on that work plan, and something we're very mindful of. That was what a lot of the criticism came through in the scrutiny reports, in terms of parents not feeling they could access the EA and weren't getting that response. So that is something we're working with them around. In terms of childcare, I can give you the assurances that we are working very closely with Paul Brish and his teams, both in terms of early years but the development of the childcare strategy, because that's where early intervention is absolutely going to be. There's also been some sharing of staff across the two teams to make sure that we are bridging that gap between early years and special educational needs. So we're working very closely with them around that.
Okay, thank you.
Cara, and if I can ask, we go to question and answer.
I will go extremely
rapidly.
quick, because we're already here in 15 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ladies. I have two questions, which I'll just deliver back to back. The first one is, our previous speaker spoke very passionately about mental health and school attendance, and the shocking statistics on the number of our young people that aren't showing up for school. And she believes, and I share her belief, that a huge aspect of this is to do with children who have special educational needs, who have severe anxiety, and aren't showing up. And I'm just mindful in my own constituency in the Northern Trust area, the CAMS waiting lists are off the charts. It's absolutely outrageous, and I'm just wondering, does your department liaise with the Department of Health on mental health and well-being of our young people in schools, and have there been conversations about using our classrooms as a place to talk more about mental health, well-being and suicide prevention? And then my second question is, which I actually raised with our previous speaker as well, was just around, I note I'm the only Northwest representative on the Education Committee, and on Friday I went to St Colum's College in Derry, and fantastic pupils, but while I was there I noted their funding had been withdrawn for a wheelchair lift, and when we talk about inclusion and the importance of equal access to opportunities, both pupils and staff were devastated that this funding had been removed. So I'm just, while I'm here, using the opportunity, of course, to ask if you could take that to the department, to the Minister, to wherever possible reinstate that funding, or perhaps even have a visit to the school to see what positive impact that would have. It's in their theatre room. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. I was out at St Column some time ago myself, so I know the school, but we can take that issue away and explore it further and come back to you. In terms of your first point around emotional health and well-being, the links to attendance, we're very clear in terms of both the anecdotal evidence and what the data is saying around the rise in anxiety-based school refusal, and it very much plays into my opening remarks about the ongoing impact of the pandemic. We have had direct engagement with young people themselves who have spoken to us of the rise in those issues. In terms of our work with the Department of Health, we do work closely. You'll be aware of the DE-DOH Children and Young People's Emotional Health and Wellbeing and Education Framework. That is that collaborative framework. It was published back in February 2021. It supports a range of pilot projects, both in terms of health-led projects and projects led through the EA. Of course, we need to learn from those projects to inform a longer-term approach and to further develop that framework, but it's a very helpful starting point. There's also broader discussions for us to have in the department around how we support children's emotional health and well-being. You've referred to the Healthy Happy Minds pilot. That has been evaluated. We're considering the findings of that to inform advice to the Minister. The post-primary school counselling service, that contract will due to end in August of this year. EA has already began their work in terms of informing what comes after that. So we're very mindful of the need for this, the rising issues in our society, and we'll continue to work closely with the Department of Health around it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cara. And Robbie.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just reading through, I was scrolling through some documents, and disability discrimination is nothing new in the world and in Northern Ireland in terms of the educational context. I'm looking back at documents here from 2005, which is almost 20 years ago, when they came up with SENDO, and then we get the revised amendments to the Acts and so on. And we think back to the former committee, there was an internal review held by EA. And one of the words that came out of that, one of the failures with the team at that time was the culture that existed in that group. But that's not there now anymore. But I'm thinking to the people that have been before you, and we got an inference perhaps of someone who has suffered some disability discrimination, not so much the SEN stuff, but disability discrimination in terms of access to schools. So thinking about the culture, how is a school's culture measured in regards to its ethos for inclusiveness? How do we do that? Does ETI do it? Possibly. Is it something that's measured and picked up? And also on PRSD, could we maybe have a wee talk about PRSD and what's happening with the department and their interaction with schools in regards to getting that revised and changed? Thank you, Chair.
Great question. Okay, in terms of your point around, I think it links back to what we're talking about around inclusion, Robbie. Part of it has to be how we're defining inclusion, and then equipping, supporting our schools around that. When we go out to many schools, you can clearly see a very inclusive ethos. Many of them mightn't call that, but it's there, and you can feel it and you can see it. Obviously, you'll be aware, and I can't speak for ETI. ETI are developing their new inspection strategy in terms of the areas it is going to look at, what it's going to measure within a school and what it'll be looking for. But I think the development of our pathway to inclusion is going to be key around this, and it will have to look at both how we can support schools to adopt that ethos, to understand what it means in practical terms, but also how it links to teacher professional learning. Because everybody can understand inclusion to be something slightly different. I know when I've visited some specialist provisions in mainstream, I know it's inclusion, I can feel it, I can see it. Hard to articulate on a page, but I think that's going to be the job of work for that inclusion roadmap, and ultimately whatever the department puts out in terms of a policy around an inclusive education system that absolutely has to link to teacher professional learning and their ongoing development.
There's obviously an issue with PRSD at the moment too, because there isn't, because of the action short of strike action, we can't do it. So that's something that I'm hoping the Minister might address. But in terms of the ETI and the role, it needs to be clearly defined what we're measuring and what's expected and what that culture is. I think that's the key thing, because if we don't have that embedded, then that would be a concern.
And that will be a key element. I mentioned in opening remarks the school improvement end-to-end review, and that will set out what we mean by a high quality school, a good school. What are the characteristics and how are we going to know they're there? So that's what's going to be setting out those measures. Then absolutely the ET inspection strategy, it needs to align with that, and there will be measures that they will be looking for when they go into a school. But you're right, the current industrial relations context has made a lot of this very challenging, Robbie, particularly around the teacher professional learning. And we know that we need to create space within which we can take forward some of this work around teacher professional learning in an environment that isn't what we have currently.
Just finally, just to finish that out, because obviously the pay negotiations are hopefully coming to. Is this an opportunity with the pay negotiations when our teachers are paid fairly for what they do to see those changes that need to happen? Absolutely. To ensure that we have that?
Pay is the fundamental issue. We know there are many issues of concern to the teaching workforce, workload being others, but pay is certainly that primary concern.
One last one just occurred to me. Nursery schools and special, so there was an issue this year because we cut. The reality is that there was cut the nursery provision in specials to facilitate the increased numbers in P1. So in terms of September 24, will we see a return to nursery provision?
Just to be clear, the department didn't cut nursery provision. The EA prioritised P1 placements as a way of ensuring that those placements were in place for P1s, but there was no cut to nursery.
It's not a statutory provision, but I would say that if they're not there, technically they were cut.
And that was a decision taken in terms of prioritising the placements within EA. And we don't want to be in that place where children aren't able to access nursery spaces to allow for others to have places. So that is something we'll be working with EA around in terms of that placements work.
Thank you, Chair.
we're definitely out of time. So thank you for your time, and there is a lot to follow up. So I doubt that will be the last engagement with the committee. But thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Or can we just quickly clarify any actions arising from that, and then we'll move on to the next item?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll follow up on a couple of issues that weren't maybe answered just now in correspondence to the department. And it might also be worth forwarding to the department the notes of the informal meetings that the committee had this week, which are in the same zone, where members heard from stakeholders about delivery.
Or could we ask for clarity in writing around the difference between the multidisciplinary teams and these, whatever the other things are called?
Integrated teams. I think that would be a helpful question to ask. Yeah.
I wasn't happy with the answer that was given there, you know, and David was right. You know, there's no reason why health shouldn't be involved from the very start. I mean, it's very disappointing.
It feels like the local integrated stuff is basically their side of what will become the multidisciplinary teams, but it doesn't make sense really that that's not joined up already.
Well, I think anyone looking in who has skin in the game here would be very disappointed by the answer that was given there. You know,
we should be raising that in writing. Absolutely, our members agreed. Yeah.
Chair, I'm just mindful. Just my apologies. I have to leave now. I have another meeting. I was just thinking, in the weeks ahead, we had talked about youth participation with the minister and presenting their concerns to the minister and having them there. I attended the youth participation APG on Monday, and it was fantastic. And I'm wondering, is there an opportunity there for us to either attend it as a committee and have them ask us questions, or is there something there we could utilise that APG that exists?
I think there's definitely scope for that. Again, if the clerk can make a note of that, what I'm going to propose in forward work planning when we get to it is that I think we do need to take a bit of a strategic overview on forward work planning and take it out of this format, because it's so squeezed at time at the end. So I think if we can get commitment from all members to give up a little bit of time to do that separate to this forum, then I think we can start to feed, because there's a lot of stuff comes through every week of things we should be prioritising. By the time we get to forward work planning, we have about 2 minutes left, and it's a rush. So I think that would be a good way forward. But happy to note that. Okay. So this brings us on to item 7, and I'm really conscious of time here on this one, because we want to make sure that we are giving this proper scrutiny. So I would just refer members to page 50 of their packs. It's SL1, the period products, Department of Education, Specified Public Service Bodies Regulations NI 2024. So the paper that we've received from the department proposes a set of regulations to implement the provisions of the Cross-Departmental Period Products Act. The department designates those of its public bodies which will provide the products, and notes that given the policy intention of the Act to make products widely available, that the department aims to minimise any limitation of this provision in terms of making the regulations. And we have two officials from the department here with us if there are any questions. But I just wanted to sort of draw out that as this regulation is draft affirmative, my understanding of our role is to scrutinise the regulation and then feed that back to the department before it is brought to the Assembly for approval. And I think for me the key question is the timescales under which we think that is likely to happen, and whether members feel we maybe need to bring this back to another meeting. So I don't know, can the department speak to that in terms of when you think this regulation is likely to come forward to the Assembly? Yeah, if you would like to come forward, absolutely, please. So I think we have Ashley Mitford joining us from the department, and Dale Heaney. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. Yes, the work has been preceded by a 3-year pilot, of course, in schools where we've provided free period products for pupils for the last 3 years, and that has very much helped pave the way for this legislation, which will now provide period products for teachers, visitors, and other staff within school settings, but also across the wider arm's length bodies of the department. So really, once the committee is happy with the draft regulations, it can be brought forward to the Assembly at that time. I'm conscious that other departments have moved forward in that regard as well. So there is a question, I suppose, about whether or not it would be helpful to run a debate on those regulations consecutively, perhaps. So that is one option, but relates us whenever the committee has had time to review the regulations and is content.
I'd seek a view from members whether we feel a separate oral briefing and an opportunity to scrutinise that in a committee session would be helpful, or if we are happy to look at this now. I am conscious that time is short and I don't want to rush it today, but do members have a view?
I think, given that we are going to be rushed, probably would be better putting it off for a while. Don't want to be accused of rushing stuff through.
Absolutely, that'd be my feeling. If we could sooner rather than later to have if officials are able to make themselves available to give us a more detailed briefing on this, and then we can hopefully move forward. Sorry.
Point of clarity, just if it's okay to the department. In terms of the debates around the bill when we were bringing it through, it was more wide ranging than the period product because of the pilot. Is there anything then coming forward in regard to that with for the wider discussion? So I think the debate will be a multi-department debate because the sponsoring body for it is TEO, I think, for the legislation, and obviously education's in there, but probably the most significant and important part, being it's about young people. But the education piece, apart from just the provision of the product, would that be something we can speak into as well in terms of the briefing? Would that be fair? Because if that's the case, then it's really important that we afford it the time.
Yeah. I think at 5:30 to do this in 5 or 10 minutes would not be given this the scrutiny it requires, would be my view. So, but I think it's important we get it back on a committee agenda very quickly. I wouldn't want this to be left indefinitely.
Yeah, I think provisionally we might have a space on the 10th of April, if that were okay with. So we'll discuss that in forward work planning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, if we can see if there's any space sooner than that. Even would be my feeling if we could make that work. But we'll discuss that when we get to the right point of the agenda. So look, I appreciate you've given up a lot of your time for that, but we do want to make sure we give this the time it requires. So thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so that takes us to correspondence, which I hope we can get through fairly quickly as we have in previous weeks. So I would refer members to pages 57 to 107 of their packs, and then also to page 7 of tabled papers. And there's also at page 58 in the pack there is a summary note of the correspondence. So I'll just quickly draw out the ones requiring an action, and then hopefully we can note the remainder. So item 8.3, it's a letter from the Committee for the Economy indicating its willingness to undertake joint scrutiny work on the topic of a review of careers guidance. Are members content to welcome the correspondence from the committee and suggest a joint meeting of the Education and Economy committees to review the 14 to 19 strategy, and to do that before the summer recess? Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Item 8.4, correspondence from STEAM NI on the importance of involving industry in the development of STEM and arts within the primary sector, and there is a specific ask to present to the committee on this area of education. Also an invite there for members to visit one of the schools involved in the project. Are members happy that in terms of visiting individual schools that they can respond to STEAM NI individually, and then that perhaps we could invite STEAM NI to present to the committee when we do hold that joint committee session, as there's crossover there? Are members agreed?
Yeah, great.
Item 8.5, that's correspondence from Sentinus highlighting that its funding has been withdrawn by the Department of Education, and that they are at risk of ceasing operation next year. Are members content that we write to the department on the back of that to seek more information on those funding cuts to the organisation, and any other cuts that have been made in that space in the absence of a devolved minister, and also share that correspondence with the Economy Committee? Are we agreed? Item 8.8, that is correspondence from an individual who highlights that they run a campaign that saved a local school from closure, and are asking to brief the committee to highlight areas for further consideration in relation to sustainable schools policy. Are members content if we respond to the individual to thank them for their correspondence and invite them to provide a further written submission of their evidence in relation to this for the committee's consideration?
Agreed.
Items 8.10 and 8.12, there it's correspondence received from individuals highlighting their personal experiences with the impact of childcare costs, and are keen to understand actions being taken to provide support to parents. Are members happy that we respond thanking the individuals for their correspondence and confirming that childcare is a priority for this committee that we've all identified, and perhaps provide them with a record of last week's evidence session focusing on childcare in early years? Members agreed?
Yeah.
Item 8.11, that is an invite from the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, and it was an invite to the chairperson to attend the North-South Youth Peace event on the 23rd of March. Unfortunately, I've already gone back to them to advise I'm not available to attend that. It's a diary clash for me, but if members are free to attend, I think it would be good to get representation at that. Is there anybody who would be happy to agree to go at this juncture? Danny has agreed on behalf of the committee. If anybody else is
I received an invitation also,
Yes.
but again, I can't go. I'm a wedding that day, so I've asked Danny, and Danny has
If he's representing the committee, could he wear a tie, Chair? You may.
I have been wearing ties. I have been wearing ties. Definitely not on a Saturday.
Not on a Saturday, no way. No, definitely not.
Danny's agreed to represent the committee.
Yeah.
If he's wearing a tie, that's an agreed action. Okay.
Photographic evidence.
Thanks for that, Danny.
Ozzy put something else on with it.
Good point.
I'm going to officially draw a line under that discussion. Item 8.13, that's correspondence from the Bangor Central Integrated Primary School, noting its concern in relation to Fresh Start funding, similar to previous correspondence from Millennium Primary that we received. Our members content that we respond to the school and inform them that we had agreed at our previous meeting to write to the Minister, to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee and the Secretary of State in relation to this issue, and then also to keep them updated with any responses received. Okay, great. Item 8.14, that's an invitation from an Irish medium early year setting in Belfast, asking for members of the committee to visit the setting. Are members happy either? There's two ways we can approach this, that members respond to ALTRA individually if they would like to organise a visit, or if there's an interest in a joint visit collectively, we can coordinate that through the clerk. So is there anybody in particular interested in visiting that setting?
I think I got an invitation from another one, possibly. I think it was a different one, maybe. So.
Okay.
Well, it would be useful for the committee, Chair, because the Irish medium sector faces unique difficulties that aren't there in other sectors, so it would certainly be informative for the committee.
It's the crossover with the early education strategy and how it links into that as well. So I mean, I'm happy if any members are interested in that.
Do you remember was something said at the start about that's there's
in each sector in turn, wasn't it?
Yeah, each sector,
So
and
we can
one for each. It's just I don't know about this one, but I know we get a lot of invitations, so it's just whether rather than just taking this one as read, no objection to it, we sort of look at the invitation we've got and decide sectorally which ones are.
Yeah, I mean, I think making sure that we do cover all of the sectors in the education system is important. I was going to just suggest that any members with a particular interest in this to let the clerk know, and then we can coordinate that from there. If members are content with that, and again in that strategic session that we'll hopefully get to, we can look at maybe an overview of the sectors that we want to.
If we knew when we were going to sort of decide that, you could then let colleagues know if any others want to submit invites to be. For that,
yeah, so. I need to write to you to see when would be a good time for you generally to take to do the visit, and also when might be a good time for you to do strategic work, because everybody's diaries are chock-a-block.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll write, and you can all tell me that.
Okay, well, I'll leave it for individual members to feed back to the clerk in the interim, and then we'll take a wider look at visits across the sectors from there. Item, our members agreed on that? Sorry, just to check. Are we agreed on 8.15? Or 8.14, sorry. 8.15, that's correspondence from the NSPCC regarding working with the committee on some of their key priorities. Our members content we go back and thank NSPCC for the correspondence and notify them of our intended focus on the theme of RSE, which they specifically raised, and ask if advise them that we'd be happy to consult with them in relation to that, and also that we'd had previous correspondence from other charitable bodies in the children's sphere, and again if we're doing a round table session with them to extend that to the NSPCC. Members agreed. And then item 8.19, some correspondence from young people impacted by long COVID, and I'm conscious this was an issue, and some of the specific cases referenced had cut across the committee's work in the previous mandate. Is the committee content in the first instance that we do write back to the young people concerned and to thank them for their correspondence and seek their consent to share that correspondence with the Minister and EE to get an update on what actions the Department is taking, and specifically in relation to clean air in school, because that's the issue they do seem most concerned about. Are we content with that? Yeah, and that was in tabled papers, just in case anyone hadn't had that. So that was in the updated tabled papers. It came through quite late today. It was quite extensive correspondence from a few young people.
Yeah,
so,
they did expect to be here. They wanted to come and hear the commissioner, but I don't think that they were in the end. So.
Yeah. But But I think it's important as well that we see what comes back from the Minister and the EA on that, and it would be important to continue engaging with them, because I think the issues they raised were quite concerning. So, with the exception of those items, are we content that all other items of correspondence are noted? Members agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. So that takes us to item 9, and that's the forward work programme. And I would be proposing at this stage that we note the forward work programme. We do have a good set of sessions set up for the next 2 or 3 weeks, but that we engage with the clerk very rapidly in terms of availability for a strategic session. And I'm not asking you to give up a full day or anything like it, but just to give up a portion of time so that we can really drill down into those strategic priorities when there's proper time. Our members agreed?
Yep, agreed, yeah.
Just in terms of next week, is Gordon and Gail Sculliac coming in? It just says here to be confirmed.
Yes, they are.
They're confirmed?
Yeah, so actually next week, well, the 1st to the 17th of March is Seachtain na Gaeilge, and we did have our booking in first for the simultaneous interpretation service, but the Speaker and the Communities Committee are having, they're going to use it before we get to use it, but we will use it for Colia na Gael Sculliac next week, and we'll also have in the informal meeting on Tuesday morning the other group, Gael Lynn, exactly. So yeah, that's the part or all of the presentation will be given in Irish, and you'll be able to put on headphones and listen in, and then ask questions in Irish or English as you choose. Just other confirmed items there are registered childminders NI on the 19th for the informal meeting, the mental health champion for the 20th. Invitations have gone to youth groups for the 20th as well, SSU NI and the Youth Forum, Diverse Youth NI, the Youth Assembly and the Nicky panel. The Minister has advised availability from 2 to 3 that day, so ordinarily we would have had the other stakeholders beforehand, and we're not having that flexibility afforded on this occasion. So that's all I have for you.
Happy to note at that stage and agree that. Okay, yeah. So item 10, any other business? I'm hoping the answer is no here. Any members got any other business? That's fine. We will move on to item 11, and that's date, time and place of next meeting. So Wednesday the 13th of March, 2 p.m, room 29. So I propose that the committee meeting does now adjourn. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Committee Room 29, Sound.